December 16th, 1944. American soldiers in the Ardennes believed the war was nearly won. The forest was quiet. Defensive positions were thin. Most units were resting after brutal fighting in the Ardennes forest. But in the pre-dawn darkness, something was waiting. 2,000 German artillery pieces, 250,000 soldiers, and Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and reach Antwerp before the Reich collapsed entirely. At 5:30 a.m., the largest German offensive in the West since 1940 began. Within hours, entire American regiments were surrounded. Roads became death traps. Villages turned into battlefields, fought house by house through a winter that killed as efficiently as bullets. 80 miles of front exploded into chaos. This is the complete story of the Battle of the Bulge, from the surprise that shattered the quiet front, through the siege of Bastogne, where one word became legend to the frozen villages, where armies ground each other down in battles that had no front lines. 75,000 American casualties, Germany's last offensive power destroyed, and winter warfare that soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. The Ardennes looked like the quietest place on the Western Front. Dense evergreen forests stretched across rolling hills, interrupted by narrow valleys, where single-lane roads wound through hamlets built centuries before tanks existed. Villages carried names most American soldiers couldn't pronounce: Clairvaux, Wiltz, Vielsalm, places where church bells still rang at dawn, and farmers still hauled milk in wooden carts. The land felt medieval, it felt slow, and in the autumn of 1944, that made it attractive to Allied commanders looking for somewhere to rest battered divisions. By late November, the US First Army held an 80-mile stretch of this forested front, with only 4 divisions, roughly 1 division per 20 miles. That was thin by any standard. Normal defensive doctrine called for far denser coverage, but Allied planners considered the Ardennes a secondary sector. The real fighting was happening north, where British and American forces pushed toward the Rhine, and south, where Patton's Third Army ground toward the Saar. The forest in between was a place to rotate tired units, integrate replacements, and let soldiers sleep in actual beds when billets could be found. The 99th Infantry Division had arrived in early November, a green unit that had never seen combat. The 106th Infantry Division reached the front in mid-December, so new that some men still wore the patches from their stateside training camps. Between them sat the 28th Infantry Division, veterans of the Ardennes Forest, a brutal, months-long meat grinder that left the division under strength and exhausted. The 4th Infantry Division anchored the southern shoulder, equally worn from Ardennes' endless tree-to-tree fighting. These divisions stretched along a front that had seen almost no German activity since September. Patrols encountered silence. Artillery exchanges were sporadic. Intelligence reports noted occasional movement, but nothing suggesting buildup. The mood was cautious, but not alarmed. Soldiers dug foxholes, strung wire, and settled into routines that felt more like occupation than combat. Some officers joked that the Ardennes was where the war went to rest. Across the German border, in the Eifel Highlands, a different reality was taking shape. Throughout late November and early December, German units moved west under strict radio silence. Troops marched at night. Vehicles traveled without headlights. Assembly areas were concealed under camouflage netting and forest canopy. Allied reconnaissance aircraft saw nothing unusual, just another stretch of quiet border forest. On the ground, forward American outposts occasionally heard distant engine noise, but nothing systematic, nothing that suggested concentration. What they couldn't see was the largest German offensive buildup in the West since 1940. Adolf Hitler had approved the plan in September, overriding objections from senior commanders who considered it logistically impossible. The operation bore the code name Wacht am Rheinwatch, on the Rhine, a defensive-sounding name meant to confuse Allied intelligence if the plan leaked. Its actual goal was anything but defensive. Germany would mass 3 armies, More than 200,000 troops, nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and 2,000 artillery pieces strike through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest toward Antwerp, the Allies' primary supply port. If successful, the offensive would split British and American forces, encircle 4 Allied armies, and potentially force a negotiated settlement that might keep Germany alive into 1945. The plan depended on 3 conditions: complete surprise, rapid penetration, and bad weather to ground Allied air power. Surprise required absolute operational security. German troops were forbidden from writing letters. Officers carried sealed orders opened only at the last minute. Reconnaissance was conducted by soldiers in American uniforms, driving captured jeeps, small teams trained to spread confusion and cut communication lines behind enemy positions. Fuel depots and ammunition dumps were positioned just behind the front, camouflaged and dispersed to avoid detection. Speed required capturing key road junctions intact before American reinforcements could block them. The Ardennes was a logistical nightmare. Few paved roads, narrow bridges, steep grades. Tanks and trucks would have to move in single-file columns for miles. If any major junction stayed in American hands, entire divisions could be delayed for days. The operational timetable allowed no room for delay. German planners calculated that armored spearheads had to reach the Meuse within 48 hours, Antwerp within a week. Any slower and Allied reinforcements would close the gap. Weather was the wild card Germany couldn't control but desperately needed. Low clouds and fog would keep Allied fighter bombers grounded, giving German columns a chance to move during daylight without being strafed. Clear skies meant death from above, thunderbolts and typhoons turning roads into burning wreckage. German meteorologists predicted a period of overcast skies starting December 16th. That became the launch date. By mid-December, the German buildup was complete. 3 armies stood ready. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich, 4 SS Panzer divisions, and supporting infantry, the heaviest concentration of German armor in the west. Their mission: smash through American lines near Monschau, race northwest toward Liège and the Meuse. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, 7 divisions, tasked with the deepest penetration, aiming for Bastogne and points west. In the south, the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger, 4 infantry divisions assigned to protect the southern flank and prevent American counterattacks from Luxembourg. The entire offensive depended on fuel Germany didn't have. German logistics officers calculated that the advancing armies would need roughly 5 million gallons of gasoline to reach their objectives. Germany could provide less than half that amount at the start. The rest would have to be captured from American supply dumps overrun during the advance. This wasn't optimism, it was desperation, dressed as operational planning. If fuel ran out before the Meuse, the offensive would stall, and stalled armor and winter became stationary targets. On the American side of the line, life continued in quiet routine. Soldiers woke in frozen foxholes, stamped circulation back into numb feet, ate cold rations, and scanned empty tree lines. Some received mail from home letters that had traveled weeks to reach the front. Others wrote replies by candlelight in dugouts smelling of pine sap and tobacco. In command posts deeper behind the lines, staff officers updated maps with red and blue grease pencils, tracking patrol reports that showed nothing alarming. At Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles, intelligence analysts reviewed the same data and reached the same conclusion. Germany lacked the strength for a major offensive. German industry was being pounded by Allied bombers. Fuel production had collapsed. Armor losses on the Eastern Front were catastrophic. Any remaining reserves would logically be sent east to stop the Soviets, not west, where defeat was already inevitable. The Ardennes remained what it had always been, a quiet sector. But quiet was about to shatter. On the evening of December 15th, forward American outposts reported unusual sounds, tracked vehicles, maybe trucks, moving somewhere beyond the frontier. A few officers grew uneasy. Most dismissed it as routine supply traffic. Soldiers checked their weapons, added extra socks against the cold, and settled in for another night of frozen watch duty. Across the border, German assault troops crouched in assembly areas, waiting for the order to move. The temperature dropped, fog thickened, and the forest held its breath. The plan existed on paper-clean lines, timetables, objectives marked in red. Reality was mud, ice, and a fuel shortage that made every gallon sacred. Inside command bunkers dug into Eifel hillsides, German staff officers studied maps by lamplight and calculated miracles. The offensive required moving more than 200,000 soldiers, 1,000 armored vehicles, and 2,000 artillery pieces through a road network designed for farmers and timber trucks. Every division had a march table, an exact schedule dictating when units would cross the border, which roads they would use, which junctions they had to seize, and when they had to reach each objective. Delays were forbidden. The entire plan assumed perfect synchronization, but synchronization required fuel, and fuel was the Reich's bleeding wound. By December 1944, Germany's oil situation was catastrophic. Allied bombing had destroyed synthetic fuel plants across the Ruhr and Silesia. Romania's Ploiești oil fields, once Germany's primary natural source, had been lost to Soviet advances. Remaining production barely kept the Luftwaffe's training schools running, let alone frontline operations. For the Ardennes offensive, quartermasters scraped together roughly 2.5 million gallons, half of what operational plans required to reach Antwerp. The shortfall wasn't hidden. Senior commanders knew. They protested. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander in the West, called the offensive a gamble with no strategic foundation. Model, commanding Army Group B, requested the plan be scaled down to a limited pincer attack that wouldn't require driving all the way to the Meuse. Hitler overruled both. The attack would proceed as designed. Fuel would be captured from American depots along the way. This wasn't confidence. It was fantasy encoded as logistics. German intelligence estimated that American supply dumps near the front contained millions of gallons of gasoline, stacked in 5-gallon jerry cans, and guarded by rear echelon troops, who would flee at the first sign of panzers. Capturing those dumps became a mission objective, as critical as seizing bridges. Special armored spearheads, Kampfgruppen built around SS Panzer battalions, were tasked with racing deep into American rear areas to grab fuel before it could be destroyed. The most aggressive of these spearheads was Kampfgruppe Peiper, named for its commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper. Peiper's group consisted of roughly 5,000 men, 100 tanks, and assault guns, including dozens of Panthers and a company of Tiger IIs plus half-tracks, support vehicles, and enough fuel to reach the first American supply dumps. After that, Peiper's tanks would drink captured gasoline. The timetable gave him 24 hours to reach high on the Meuse. Any slower and follow-on divisions would jam the roads behind him. But speed required roads, and the Ardennes had precious few. German engineers studied aerial photographs and civilian maps, marking every paved route, every bridge capable of supporting 60-ton tanks, every village intersection where columns might intersect and create gridlock. They built traffic control schedules, assigning specific hours to specific units. Armor moved first, followed by motorized infantry, then horse-drawn artillery and supply wagons. Military police were positioned at every junction with orders to keep traffic flowing, regardless of air attack or confusion. The choreography looked elegant on paper. In practice, it meant that if any single bridge was destroyed, entire divisions would halt. German commanders understood this vulnerability. They planned around it by assigning engineers to every assault column, with orders to repair or bypass obstacles within hours, not days. Pontoon bridges, timber trestles, and prefabricated spans were stockpiled near the frontier. Assault engineers carried explosives to clear roadblocks and flamethrowers to burn through infantry positions blocking narrow defiles. But engineering couldn't solve the weather. December in the Ardennes meant freezing rain, ice-slicked roads, and mechanical failures that no amount of training could prevent. Tanks broke down, Engines refused to start. Tracks threw cleats on frozen cobblestones. German maintenance crews worked through the night, but every breakdown was a minute stolen from a timetable already built on optimism. And then there was the human cost already visible before the first shot. Soldiers assembled in the Eifel were tired. Many divisions had been pulled from the Eastern Front after brutal fighting in Poland and East Prussia. Others had been scraped together from training depots, filled with teenagers and men over 40 soldiers who had never experienced mechanized warfare's relentless pace. They were issued winter uniforms, but not enough. Frostbite was already appearing in assembly areas. Medical officers requisitioned straw to insulate foxholes and heated tents for the worst cases. But resources were limited. Morale was a strange mix of fatalism and hope. Veterans knew the war was lost. Germany's cities were rubble. The Soviets were advancing across the Vistula. The Western Allies controlled the skies. But orders came from Hitler, and Hitler promised that this offensive would change everything. Split the Allies, force negotiations, buy time for new weapons to enter production. Some soldiers believed it. Others simply obeyed. A few deserted, slipping into the forest to wait out the war. Most stayed, gripping rifles in frozen hands and waiting for the signal to move. The artillery plan was the offensive's foundation. Over 2,000 guns and rocket launchers were positioned within range of American forward positions. Fire missions were synchronized down to the minute, a massive preparatory bombardment timed to begin at 5:30 a.m. On December 16th, 1944, the barrage would target command posts, communication hubs, artillery positions, and known troop concentrations. German planners hoped the bombardment would paralyze American decision-making long enough for assault infantry to close the distance and overrun forward outposts before anyone could call for help. Ammunition was stacked in concealed dumps, high explosive, smoke, and propaganda shells, designed to demoralize rather than destroy. Rocket batteries loaded Nebelwerfer tubes with incendiary rounds intended to ignite fuel and supply dumps. Every gun crew received written fire orders sealed until the morning of the attack. Radio silence was absolute. The deception effort extended to every level. German radio operators transmitted fake traffic, suggesting defensive preparations along the Rhine. Dummy vehicles were positioned near river crossings to draw Allied reconnaissance attention eastward. Captured American vehicles were repainted and assigned to special commando teams trained to operate behind enemy lines, spreading confusion, cutting phone lines, and misdirecting traffic. Some of these soldiers spoke fluent English. Others carried forged documents and wore American uniforms, a violation of the laws of war that would have severe consequences if captured. But Hitler had approved the plan. An approval from the Führer made everything permissible. By December 14th, assembly was complete. Divisions crouched in forests and ravines, concealed from aerial observation by camouflage netting and overcast skies. Tanks idled in groves. Engines kept warm to ensure they'd start when ordered forward. Infantrymen lay in shallow scrapes, wrapped in blankets, eating cold rations and checking weapons for the 100th time. Officers synchronized watches and reviewed maps by shielded flashlight. And the fuel question remained unresolved. Quartermasters calculated consumption rates, gallons per mile, miles per hour, hours until the Meuse. Every calculation ended the same way. Germany didn't have enough. Captured supplies weren't a contingency. They were the plan's operational center. If American forces destroyed their own fuel dumps during retreat, the offensive would die on the road. But retreat assumed Americans knew the attack was coming. Allied intelligence had missed the buildup entirely. Ultra-intercepts decrypted German radio traffic showed nothing alarming. Aerial reconnaissance photographed empty forests. Ground patrols encountered silence. The few reports of increased activity were dismissed as local repositioning. Eisenhower's staff considered the Ardennes so secure that they scheduled a wedding for one of his aides on December 18th in Paris. A decision that would look tragically optimistic within days. The Germans had achieved complete surprise. On the night of December 15th through 16th, final orders were issued. Assault troops moved into forward positions. Artillery crews loaded shells. Tank commanders briefed drivers on routes and objectives. Across 80 miles of frozen forest, men checked grenades, tightened bootlaces, and waited for dawn. The fuel trucks sat ready, half empty, promising range they didn't have. And the clock began counting down to 5:30. The artillery began exactly on time. At 5:30, German guns opened fire along an 80-mile front from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. The sound was immense, a rolling thunder that shook snow from trees and rattled windows in villages miles behind the lines. High explosive shells crashed into American positions, tearing apart log and earth bunkers, severing telephone wires, and igniting fuel dumps that soldiers had considered safely distant from the quiet front. In foxholes and dugouts, American soldiers woke to chaos. Explosions walked across defensive positions in mathematical patterns, each impact zone carefully plotted by German forward observers during weeks of quiet reconnaissance. Smoke shells mixed with high explosive, creating a choking fog that made visibility impossible. Soldiers groped for helmets and rifles, shouting questions no one could answer over the continuous roar. Some positions took direct hits, structures collapsing inward, burying men under frozen earth and splintered timber. The barrage lasted 90 minutes in most sectors, longer in others. Communication lines snapped under the bombardment. Battalion and regimental headquarters lost contact with forward companies. Radio operators cranked hand generators and called into static. Runners were sent forward through shell fire, some arriving with messages, others disappearing into the smoke. In command posts, lit by flickering oil lamps, officers tried to piece together what was happening from fragmentary reports that made no tactical sense. At 6:30, the guns lifted. Silence rushed into the vacuum, a strange, ringing quiet, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the crackle of burning timber. Soldiers emerged from cover, ears still stunned, trying to assess damage. Some positions had been obliterated, others had survived intact, protected by forest canopy or simple luck. Medics moved among the wounded, applying bandages and morphine, triaging who could wait and who needed immediate evacuation. Then the infantry came. German assault troops moved forward in the pre-dawn darkness, guided by compass bearings and memorized terrain features. They advanced through fog and smoke, closing the distance before American defenders fully understood they were under attack. In some sectors, German soldiers were inside American positions before anyone fired a shot. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in bunkers and communication trenches, brutal, close-range work with grenades, rifle butts, and bayonets. The northern shoulder saw the heaviest initial assault. The 6th Panzer Army's attack hit positions held by the Green 99th Infantry Division near Monschau and the more experienced 2nd and 9th Infantry Divisions further south. German assault infantry elite Volksgrenadier formations reinforced with engineers and assault guns moved through forested draws and along creek beds, trying to infiltrate between American strongpoints. Defensive fire was sporadic at first, then intensified as American units oriented toward the threat. In some places, the defense held immediately. At Monschau itself, entrenched positions on high ground poured machine gun and mortar fire into advancing German columns. The elevation advantage made direct assault suicidal. German infantry tried flanking maneuvers, only to run into pre-registered artillery zones that American forward observers called down with brutal efficiency. By mid-morning, the northern attack had stalled against terrain and firepower, costing the 6th Panzer Army hours it couldn't afford to lose. Further south, the situation was more fluid. In the center sector, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army struck positions held by the 106th Infantry Division, America's newest division on the line. In position for less than a week, the German attack bypassed some strongpoints entirely, pushing through gaps in the thinly held line and moving into the rear. American units found themselves surrounded or cut off, losing radio contact with higher headquarters and forced to make decisions based on incomplete information. The Schnee-Eifel Ridge became a focal point of confusion. Two regiments of the 106th, the 422nd and 423rd, sat on high ground that overlooked both sides of the German border. Good defensive terrain, but isolated. German forces moved around both flanks, severing the regiments from their parent division and cutting the roads that supplied them. By midday, roughly 8,000 American soldiers were encircled on a snow-covered ridgeline, with no clear way out and no orders except to hold. American commanders struggled to understand the scale. Early reports suggested local attacks may be battalion-sized probes. Division headquarters requested clarification. Corps headquarters asked for map coordinates and enemy strength estimates. Nobody had clear answers. Fog and smoke obscured the battlefield. Refugees began streaming West Belgium, civilians fleeing villages near the frontier, clogging roads that American reinforcements needed to move east. The first German armor appeared around 8 o'clock. Panzer columns rolled through gaps punched by assault infantry, their appearance confirmation that this wasn't a raid, it was an offensive. American anti-tank gunners engaged at point-blank range, knocking out lead vehicles and creating temporary roadblocks. German tanks returned fire with high explosive shells, collapsing buildings and silencing gun positions. Where roads were blocked, engineers moved forward with explosives to clear wreckage, while infantry suppressed defensive fire from adjacent buildings. In villages along the front, civilians became casualties. Artillery didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets. Shells fell on homes, churches, schools, families sheltered in cellars, listening to the thunder above and wondering when it would be safe to move. Some villages changed hands multiple times in a single day. German infantry pushing through, American counterattacks, driving them back. Neither side staying long enough to secure the ground. Civilians caught in the middle paid in blood. By noon, American higher command began to grasp the situation's seriousness. Reports from multiple sectors confirmed heavy attacks supported by armor. The Germans weren't probing, they were attacking in force across the entire Ardennes front. 1st Army headquarters ordered all available reserves forward. The 7th Armored Division, resting near the Dutch border, received orders to move south immediately towards Streetvith. The 10th Armored Division, part of Patton's 3rd Army in the south, was redirected north toward Bastogne. Airborne divisions on rest in France were alerted for possible deployment, but moving reserves took time, and time was bleeding away. German spearheads pushed west, guided by maps and the desperate need to reach objectives before American reinforcements arrived. Some columns made rapid progress, overrunning supply dumps and capturing fuel they desperately needed. Other columns bogged down in small unit firefights, losing hours clearing villages that should have been empty. The weather remained Germany's ally. Heavy clouds blanketed the Ardennes, keeping Allied fighter bombers grounded. American soldiers scanned empty skies, looking for the thunderbolts and lightnings that had dominated the battlefield since Normandy. The planes stayed grounded, useless weight on mud-soaked airfields in France and Belgium. Without air support, American defenders had to stop German armor with rifles, bazookas, and sheer determination. Communication failures compounded every problem. Telephone wires were cut, radio nets jammed with overlapping traffic. Messengers were sent on foot or by jeep, racing through shellfire to deliver orders that were often outdated by the time they arrived. In some sectors, battalion commanders made decisions based on rumor and the sound of gunfire, guessing where the enemy was and hoping their guesses were correct. By dusk, the first day's map was a nightmare. German penetrations ranged from a few hundred yards to several miles deep. American units were scattered, some still holding forward positions, others retreating in good order, a few completely surrounded. Casualties were heavy but impossible to count accurately. Aid stations overflowed. Wounded men were loaded into trucks and driven west over roads clogged with refugees and retreating supply vehicles. The battle had no clear front line anymore. German and American units intermingled in the dark forest, sometimes passing within yards of each other without making contact. Soldiers dug hasty foxholes wherever night found them, posting sentries and trying to stay warm in sub-freezing temperatures. The forest was full of sound engines, distant gunfire, voices calling in German and English, the crunch of boots on frozen ground. And behind the confusion, German commanders checked timetables, and saw that they were already behind schedule. The offensive's first day was supposed to achieve breakthrough, clear penetration, open roads, armor racing west. Instead, German forces were tangled in small unit fighting, burning fuel to move short distances, and facing American resistance that refused to collapse. Piper's Kampfgruppe was still stuck near the frontier, waiting for roads to clear. Entire divisions sat in traffic jams, created by narrow roads and blown bridges. The plan was already fraying, but the attack continued. Orders remained unchanged: push west, seize the Meuse, drive for Antwerp. German soldiers advanced into the night, guided by burning villages and the hope that American lines would break tomorrow. American soldiers held where they could and retreated where they had to, buying time measured in hours and paid for in lives. The first day of the Battle of the Bulge ended without resolution, just exhaustion, confusion, and the certainty that tomorrow would be worse. The Schnee Eifel was good ground to defend and terrible ground to be trapped on. A forested ridge running north to south along the German-Belgian border, it offered elevation, observation, and clear fields of fire. American troops dug in there, could see German positions across the frontier, and call artillery onto any movement. For defense, it was ideal. For withdrawal, it was a death trap. Only a few roads led west, all of them narrow, all easily blocked. By the morning of December 17th, 2 full regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, the 422nd and 423rd, sat on that ridge. Surrounded, German forces had moved around both flanks during the first day's assault, cutting the roads behind the regiments and isolating roughly 8,000 American soldiers. Division headquarters, located in Street Vith to the west, lost radio contact early. Messengers sent forward didn't return. Officers on the ridge understood their situation in fragments: German voices in the forest, distant engine sounds, the absence of resupply convoys that should have arrived hours ago. Major General Alan Jones, commanding the 106th Division, faced an impossible choice. His division had been on the line for less than a week. It was green, undertrained for this kind of fighting, and now split into pieces by a German offensive nobody had predicted. The 2 regiments on the Schnee Eifel represented half his combat power. Ordering them to withdraw meant abandoning good defensive ground and attempting a retreat through enemy-held forest. Ordering them to hold meant leaving them isolated, surrounded, and dependent on relief that might never arrive. Jones ordered them to hold. The decision was understandable. Division commanders didn't lightly abandon terrain, and higher headquarters was already moving reinforcements towards Street Vith. If the regiments could hold for 24 to 48 hours, relief might break through. If they retreated and were caught in the open, losses could be catastrophic. Jones believed his men could hold. He sent radio messages confirming the order: stay in position, fight defensively, relief is coming. But relief required roads, and the Germans controlled the roads. On the ridge, soldiers dug deeper and waited. Ammunition was rationed. Meals were cold, sea rations eaten straight from the can because fires would draw artillery. Water froze in canteens. Men stamped their feet to maintain circulation and blew on numb fingers before handling metal weapons that burned skin on contact. Foxholes became tiny fortresses, log-reinforced, camouflaged with pine branches, connected by shallow communication trenches. German artillery found them on December 17th. Shells began falling at irregular intervals, not the massed barrage of the first morning, but methodical harassment fire designed to prevent sleep, disrupt resupply, and kill a few men with each volley. Soldiers learned to listen for the whistle of incoming rounds, diving for cover seconds before impact. Trees absorbed shrapnel, showering positions with splinters and broken branches. Direct hits collapsed foxholes, burying men under frozen earth. Casualties accumulated slowly but steadily. Aid stations filled with wounded shrapnel injuries, frostbite cases, soldiers suffering from exposure and exhaustion. Medics worked with dwindling supplies, reusing bandages and stretching morphine doses. Serious cases needed evacuation, but there was no way to evacuate. The roads west were cut. Helicopters didn't exist. Wounded men lay in aid tents, hoping they'd survive until relief arrived. By December 18th, the situation was deteriorating. German infantry probed the perimeter, testing defenses and looking for weak points. Small firefights erupted and faded, leaving bodies in the snow. American defenders returned fire carefully, conserving ammunition and trying not to reveal their exact positions. Officers moved between positions, checking morale and reassuring soldiers that help was coming. But privately, they knew the truth. Radio contact with division headquarters was sporadic. Messages were brief, interrupted by static and German jamming. The last clear transmission from Street Vith confirmed that relief forces were fighting their way east, but meeting heavy resistance. No timeline was given, no promises made, just hold your positions. Food was running out. Each soldier carried a few days of rations, but those were meant to supplement regular supply deliveries. With no resupply, men were reduced to one cold meal per day. Hunger became another enemy. Exhaustion compounded by caloric deficit. Soldiers moving slower, thinking less clearly, feeling cold, penetrate deeper because their bodies had no fuel to generate warmth. Ammunition was the more critical shortage. Machine gunners counted belts and calculated rates of fire. Riflemen checked bandoliers and started thinking in terms of single, aimed shots rather than suppressive fire. Mortar crews preserved shells for defensive concentrations, refusing to waste rounds on targets of opportunity. Artillery batteries supporting the regiments were running low on shells and couldn't be resupplied. German forces tightened the noose. By December 19th, the encirclement was complete and systematic. German units positioned heavy weapons to interdict any breakout attempt. Artillery registered on every likely exit route. Infantry dug in around the perimeter, not assaulting but simply containing, letting hunger, cold, and ammunition shortages do the work. Inside the pocket, morale cracked. Some soldiers still believed relief was coming. Others faced reality. They were surrounded, outgunned, and running out of everything except snow. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but exhaustion and fear were corrosive. Small groups discussed surrender. Others talked about attempting a breakout, abandoning heavy equipment, and trying to fight through German lines in small groups. On the morning of December 19th, division headquarters sent a final message: attempt to break out to the west. The order came too late. German forces had spent 3 days preparing for exactly that move. The moment American soldiers began withdrawing from their positions, German artillery opened fire. Machine guns swept the forest. Mortar rounds fell among troops trying to move in column. The breakout dissolved into chaos. Units separated, leaders killed, soldiers scattering into the forest in small groups trying to find their way west. Some made it. Small groups of soldiers, navigated by compass and starlight, moving through German lines at night, avoiding roads and villages. They walked for days, cold and hungry, occasionally encountering other American units and joining the retreat. A few hundred reached friendly lines and were absorbed into other formations. Their stories were fragmentary, confused, traumatic. Most didn't make it. By December 21st, organized resistance on the Schnee-Eifel had collapsed. The 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments ceased to exist as fighting formations. Roughly 7,000 American soldiers surrendered, one of the largest mass surrenders of United States forces in the European theater. They were marched east into captivity, cold and exhausted, joining columns of prisoners moving toward camps in Germany. The loss shocked American command. An entire division, green but still a division, had been shattered in less than a week. The 106th Infantry Division's effective strength dropped from 15,000 to fewer than 9,000 combat-capable soldiers. 2 of its 3 regiments were gone. The survivors were scattered, demoralized, and needed immediate reorganization. But the disaster brought something invaluable: time. While German forces surrounded and reduced the Schnee-Eifel pocket, they weren't advancing west. Divisions that should have been driving toward the Meuse were instead committed to containing and destroying trapped American regiments. Roads that should have carried German armor toward Bastonian Street. Vith instead carried troops moving to tighten the encirclement. Every hour spent reducing the pocket was an hour American reinforcements used to move into blocking positions further west. Street Vith became the next critical junction. The town sat at the convergence of multiple routes running west toward the Meuse, north toward Liège, south toward Bastogne. Control of Street Vith meant control of the road network. Lose it, and German armor gained the mobility to exploit success. Hold it, and German columns stalled in traffic jams that Allied air power, once the weather cleared, could massacre. American forces rushing towards Street Vith arrived piecemeal. The 7th Armored Division, ordered south from Holland on December 16th, fought through refugee-clogged roads and arrived exhausted on December 17th. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division reached the town from the south. Survivors of the 106th Division's 3rd Regiment, the 424th, which had escaped encirclement, took up positions on the southern approach. Together, these units formed a defensive arc east and north of Street Vith, buying time for engineers to prepare demolitions on bridges and organize supply dumps for evacuation or destruction. The defenders numbered perhaps 20,000 troops, but they were tired, mixed, and unfamiliar with each other. Chain of command was improvised. The 7th Armored Division's commander, Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck, found himself coordinating units from multiple divisions under operational conditions that changed hourly. Communication was difficult, radio frequencies conflicted, telephone lines were cut, and face-to-face meetings required dangerous travel through areas under German artillery fire. But the position held. German forces attacked Street Vith from multiple directions starting December 17th. But the attacks were uncoordinated, different divisions arriving at different times, each trying to break through on its own axis without waiting for support. American defenders used the town's stone buildings as strong points, positioning anti-tank guns to cover road approaches and calling artillery onto German assembly areas visible from observation posts. The weather remained miserable, and misery helped the defense. Fog and low clouds grounded German air support and Allied air support equally, creating a brutal ground war decided by direct fire and close assault. Visibility dropped to yards. Tank commanders fought nearly blind, relying on infantry to guide them toward targets they couldn't see. American defenders used the fog to reposition, falling back from one building to occupy another, making the Germans fight for every street. Casualties mounted on both sides. German infantry losses were severe. Attacking through urban terrain against prepared defenders was a meat grinder. American losses were equally heavy, with tankers and infantry taking casualties from artillery, direct fire, and the simple exhaustion of continuous combat in freezing conditions. Aid stations operated in cellars, lit by candles, treating wounded while shells crashed above. By December 21st, Street Vith's situation was untenable. German forces had encircled the town on 3 sides. Roads west were under artillery fire. Supplies were dwindling. Higher command now coordinated under Field Marshal Montgomery, who Eisenhower temporarily assigned to command forces north of the German penetration authorized withdrawal. On the night of December 21st through 22nd, American forces pulled out of Street Vith, moving west under cover of darkness. The retreat was orderly but costly. German artillery interdicted withdrawal routes, destroying vehicles and forcing soldiers to abandon equipment. Some units became separated in the dark and had to navigate cross-country to reach American lines. Others fought rearguard actions against German forces trying to cut off the retreat. By December 23rd, Street Vith was in German hands, but the American defenders had escaped encirclement and established new positions further west. The defense of Street Vith had cost Germany 5 days. 5 days of combat, 5 days of fuel consumption, 5 days during which German spearheads should have been crossing the Meuse. Instead, they were tied down, reducing road junctions that American forces defended with desperate skill. The offensive's timetable, already strained after the first day, was now shattered. German commanders requested permission to modify objectives, to settle for smaller gains that might still be achievable. Hitler refused. The offensive would continue as planned. But the plan was dying on the roads of Belgium. Lanzerath was barely a village, a handful of stone houses clustered where a narrow road crossed the Belgian-German frontier. On the morning of December 16th, it was defended by 18 American soldiers. The men belonged to the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, a reconnaissance platoon led by First Lieutenant Lyle Buch. Their mission was simple: watch the frontier, report movement, and fall back if attacked in force. Nobody expected force. The Ardennes was quiet. Lanzerath was a backwater. Buch's platoon had spent weeks in log-covered foxholes, watching empty forest and counting days until rotation. At 5:30, the German artillery barrage began. Shells crashed into the forest around Lanzerath, shaking earth and splintering trees. Buch's men huddled in their positions, helmets pressed to frozen dirt, waiting for the bombardment to lift. When it did, silence returned, brief, ominous. Then voices carried through the fog, German voices, close. Buch ordered his men to hold fire. The platoon's positions were well concealed, foxholes dug into a hillside overlooking the road, camouflaged with logs and pine branches. If they stayed quiet, the Germans might pass without noticing. But the Germans didn't pass. They stopped. Hundreds of them, an entire battalion of German paratroopers from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite troops assigned to spearhead the 6th Panzer Army's attack. The German commander, Colonel Friedrich von der Heidet, had orders to seize Lanzerath and open the road west for the armored column following behind Kampfgruppe Peiper's heavy tanks and assault guns, already idling in assembly areas, waiting for the infantry to clear the way. Von der Heide expected light resistance, maybe a squad-sized outpost that would retreat at first contact. Instead, his battalion walked into a disciplined ambush. Buch's men waited until German infantry reached point-blank range 50 yards, then 30. When Buch gave the order, 18 rifles and 2 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The effect was devastating. German soldiers fell in clusters, caught in the open with no cover. Officers shouted orders, trying to organize an assault, but every attempt was met with concentrated fire from positions the Germans couldn't locate. The battle settled into a grinding stalemate. German paratroopers tried flanking maneuvers, crawling through snow-covered fields to get around the American position. Buch's machine gunners tracked movement and fired short bursts, conserving ammunition but maintaining pressure. German mortar teams set up behind a ridge and dropped rounds near the American foxholes, forcing the defenders to stay low between engagements. Hours passed. The fight became a test of ammunition and nerves. Buch's platoon had only what they carried: rifles, grenades, and perhaps 5,000 rounds for the machine guns. No resupply was coming. Every bullet spent brought surrender or retreat closer. German casualties mounted, but so did the pressure. More paratroopers arrived, flowing forward to reinforce the attack. The numerical imbalance grew worse with each passing hour. Behind the German lines, Kampfgruppe Peiper sat motionless. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper commanded the most powerful armored spearhead in the offensive: 100 tanks and assault guns, 5,000 men, and orders to reach the Meuse River within 24 hours. His timetable was built on speed, and speed required clear roads. Lanzerath blocked the main route west, until the paratroopers cleared that crossroads. Peiper's Panthers and Tigers couldn't advance. Peiper waited, watching the clock and burning fuel. At Lanzerath, the fight continued into afternoon. Buch's casualties mounted slowly. 1 man killed, several wounded, ammunition dwindling. German pressure intensified. Flanking attacks came closer. Mortar fire grew more accurate. The platoon's ability to hold was eroding minute by minute. Buch radioed for artillery support, for reinforcements, for any help. Responses were vague. Higher headquarters was overwhelmed. Units were engaged across the entire front. No help was available. Around 3 p.m., German armor arrived. Tanks and assault guns moved into positions where they could fire directly into the American foxholes. At that range, infantry rifles were useless. Buch's men could hear the German tank commanders shouting orders, engines revving, main guns traversing. The first high-explosive shell detonated near the foxhole line, throwing dirt and shrapnel. More rounds followed, methodically pounding the hillside. Buch made the decision. Continuing to fight meant death for soldiers who had already held far longer than anyone expected. He ordered surrender. The platoon climbed out of their foxholes, hands raised, weapons abandoned. German paratroopers moved forward cautiously, expecting a trick. When they realized the fight was genuinely over, exhausted respect replaced anger. The prisoners were searched, disarmed, and marched east. 18 American soldiers had held an entire German battalion for nearly 12 hours. The tactical consequence was immediate and catastrophic for German plans. Kampfgruppe Piper, scheduled to break through at dawn, didn't begin moving until late afternoon, 12 hours behind schedule. 12 hours during which American reinforcements moved toward blocking positions, during which German traffic jams multiplied on roads designed for farm wagons, during which fuel burned in idling engines that should have been racing west. The operational consequence would unfold over days. Piper's delayed start meant his entire thrust was compressed into fewer hours of darkness, less time to move before daylight exposed his columns to air attack. Every subsequent delay would compound. Every detour would cost fuel. Every firefight would consume time he didn't have. The offensive's timetable, already fragile, was fracturing. But in the moment, victory looked complete. German forces controlled Lanzerath. The road was open. Piper's column began rolling west shortly after 4 p.m., moving through the village that 18 American soldiers had defended all day. Tank commanders scanned the hillside where the fight had been and saw nothing remarkable, just snow-covered foxholes and abandoned equipment. They didn't understand they'd already lost the race against time. Von der Hayter understood. His battalion had taken heavy casualties against a tiny force, and the delay was unforgivable by offensive standards. He reported the engagement to higher command, noting that American resistance was far more determined than intelligence had predicted. The report was acknowledged and filed. Orders remained unchanged. Continue the attack, seize objectives, maintain momentum. Buch's platoon marched east into captivity, cold and exhausted. They had no idea how much they'd accomplished. They knew only that they'd fought, they'd survived, and the war was over for them. Guards marched them toward collection points where prisoners were sorted and processed. Some would spend months in prisoner of war camps. Others would die before the war ended. Disease, starvation, Allied bombing of German transport. The defense of Lanzerath entered history as a footnote, but footnotes matter in battles decided by hours. 18 soldiers had held for 12 hours, and 12 hours had cost an army its timetable. The Ardennes offensive was a plan built on precision, and precision was already bleeding into chaos. Joachim Paper drove his column like a man racing against physics. His orders were clear: break through American lines, drive west at maximum speed, seize bridges over the Meuse River before they could be demolished, and reach Antwerp within a week. His resources were extraordinary: 100 tanks and assault guns, including 30 Panthers, a dozen Tiger IIs, and enough veteran SS troops to storm through anything that didn't have artillery support. His enemy was time, measured in fuel consumption and road capacity. The column began moving late on December 16th, already hours behind schedule. Piper's Tigers and Panthers rolled through Lanzerath after nightfall, their engines rumbling in the darkness, tracks clattering on frozen cobblestones. The route west was narrow, a single road winding through forested valleys, over hills, through villages barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Traffic control was immediate chaos. Tanks moving at different speeds created gaps and jams. Support vehicles, half-tracks, trucks, ammunition carriers tried to keep pace, but fell behind on steep grades. Speed required fuel, and fuel was finite. Piper's tankers had been briefed on consumption rates. A Panther burned roughly 2 gallons per mile on roads, more cross-country. A Tiger II, The heaviest tank in the offensive consumed even more. The column's total fuel capacity would carry it perhaps 50 miles if nothing went wrong. The Meuse River was over 90 miles away. Capturing American fuel dumps wasn't optional. It was the operational plan's foundation. The first opportunity came at Bullingen. American forces had established a fuel depot near the town, thousands of gallons stored in jerry cans, intended to supply units advancing toward the Siegfried Line. The depot was guarded by rear echelon troops who fled when German armor appeared on December 17th. Piper's column seized the depot intact, refueling on captured American gasoline while engineers organized the remaining cans for transport. The windfall bought maybe 30 more miles of range, but Bullingen also cost time. Refueling 100 vehicles took hours, hoses connected, cans emptied, empties discarded. While Panthers drank American fuel, the offensive's timetable bled away. Paper ordered the refueling expedited, but physics allowed only so much speed. Fuel flowed at the rate it flowed. Soldiers worked as fast as cold hands allowed. By the afternoon of December 17th, the column was moving again. The route west led through Ligneuville, another small Belgian town straddling a key crossroads. American forces there were minimal service troops, a few engineers preparing demolitions on bridges. Piper's lead elements overran the town in a brief, brutal firefight. Prisoners were taken, American soldiers caught without time to retreat. What happened next darkened the battle's moral landscape. At a field near Ligneuville, German troops executed a group of American prisoners. The exact number is disputed. Accounts range from a handful to over a dozen. The killings violated the laws of war and set a precedent that would repeat at other locations along Piper's route. Word spread among American forces. The SS was murdering prisoners. The consequence was immediate, and visceral American soldiers stopped surrendering and fought harder. Knowing capture might mean execution, Piper's column continued west, leaving bodies in the snow. The road narrowed further beyond Ligneuville, winding through steep-sided valleys where a single blown bridge could halt the entire column. American engineers, retreating ahead of the German advance, destroyed bridges where they could, forcing Piper's engineers to find fords or construct bypasses. Each delay consumed time and fuel engines idling, while bulldozers cleared paths or pontoon bridges were assembled under sporadic artillery fire. By December 18th, Piper's advance was slowing. The column stretched over miles of road, strung out in a vulnerable line. Lead tanks were approaching Staumont and L'Église, towns that controlled access to the Amblev River Valley, the most direct route toward the Meuse. But American reinforcements were arriving faster than German intelligence had predicted. The 30th Infantry Division, a veteran formation, was moving into blocking positions. The 82nd Airborne Division was being rushed from France. Piper's fuel situation was becoming critical. Despite capturing the Bullingen depot, consumption had been higher than planned. Detours, off-road movement, and constant maneuvering in combat conditions burned fuel faster than straight-road cruising. Piper's Panthers were drinking their tanks dry. Some vehicles were already siphoning fuel from others, concentrating what remained into the tanks most likely to reach objectives. At Staumont, American defenders stopped the advance cold. The 30th Infantry Division occupied the town with infantry supported by towed anti-tank guns and artillery. Piper's lead tanks rolled into a well-prepared ambush, guns firing from concealed positions, knocking out Panthers at close range. The street fighting was vicious. German infantry tried to clear buildings, while American defenders fired from upper floors and cellars. Tank destroyers engaged panzers at ranges measured in yards. Buildings burned, civilians sheltered in basements, trapped between armies. Piper pulled back and tried flanking the town. His column split, with part moving north toward L'Église and part attempting to bypass Staumont entirely. But every detour used fuel, and fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. By December 19th, Kampfgruppe Piper was effectively stranded, trapped in a narrow valley, surrounded by American forces, out of fuel and out of options. Radio contact with higher command confirmed the nightmare. No fuel convoys were coming. The roads Piper had used to advance were now cut by American forces. Resupply was impossible. The Kampfgruppe was on its own. Piper made the hardest decision of his military career. On December 24th, after days of fighting from defensive positions in La Gliza, he ordered his troops to abandon all vehicles and attempt to escape on foot. Tanks, assault guns, half-tracks, everything mechanized was destroyed in place to prevent capture. Roughly 800 soldiers began moving east through American lines at night, navigating by compass, avoiding roads, moving through frozen forest, and hoping to reach German positions. Some made it. Many didn't. American patrols intercepted groups of German soldiers, moving through the woods, exhausted, frozen, unarmed, or barely armed. Firefights erupted sporadically. Some Germans surrendered. Others fought until killed. Piper himself reached German lines with a fraction of his original force, having abandoned the most powerful armored spearhead in the offensive. Behind him, La Gliza was littered with destroyed vehicles, Panthers with blown engines, Tigers stripped of fuel, half-tracks torched to prevent use. American soldiers walked among the wreckage, examining the hardware that had come so close to breaking through. Engineers photographed the vehicles, intelligence officers catalogued unit markings, and salvage crews began the work of clearing roads. Kampfgruppe Piper's offensive had lasted 8 days and advanced less than 30 miles. The Meuse River, the objective that was supposed to be reached in 24 hours, remained over 60 miles away, defended by growing American forces and impossible to reach without fuel. The most dangerous German thrust of the offensive had been stopped not by superior firepower, but by logistics fuel consumption exceeding supply, roads too narrow for rapid maneuver, and American resistance buying just enough time for reinforcements to arrive. The lesson was brutal and clear. Modern mechanized warfare consumed resources faster than pre-war logistics could supply, and when fuel ran out, the most powerful tanks became stationary monuments to failed planning. Piper's surviving troops straggled back to German lines, cold and bitter. They had fought hard, driven deep, and failed because the plan they were given ignored arithmetic. The Ardennes offensive was supposed to capture fuel along the way, but American defenders had destroyed depots before retreating or held junctions long enough for supplies to be evacuated. Germany's gamble on capturing enemy resources had failed, and without those resources, the offensive was dying on the roads of Belgium. The crossroads at Ardennes was nothing special, 2 roads intersecting in open farmland south of Malmedy. On the afternoon of December 17th, it became the site of a war crime that would haunt the battle's memory. Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, was moving south through the crossroads when Kampfgruppe Piper's lead elements approached from the east. The American unit, roughly 140 soldiers in soft-skinned vehicles and a few jeeps, was not equipped for combat with tanks. When German armor appeared, the battery commander ordered surrender. The soldiers dismounted, raised their hands, and were disarmed without resistance. What followed violated every convention of war. German troops herded the American prisoners into a field adjacent to the crossroads and left them under light guard while the main column continued west. Minutes later, German soldiers opened fire on the unarmed prisoners with machine guns and pistols. The massacre lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Soldiers who tried to run were shot. Those who played dead were killed where they lay. A few managed to escape into nearby woods, hiding in ditches and frozen streams until German forces moved on. 84 American soldiers died in the field at Ardennes. Survivors who reached American lines brought accounts of deliberate murder, prisoners shot in cold blood, wounded men finished with pistol shots to the head. No military justification, just killing. The reports reached higher command within hours and spread through frontline units by nightfall. The psychological impact was immediate and lasting. American soldiers stopped trusting surrender. Units that might have withdrawn when surrounded instead fought to the death. Soldiers encountering German forces adopted a kill or be killed mentality, assuming capture meant execution. The Malmedy massacre, as it became known, named for the nearby town, transformed the battle's character from conventional warfare to something uglier and more desperate. German command denied knowledge and responsibility. Piper, when questioned after the war, claimed he had no direct involvement and could not control every action by troops under his command during fluid combat operations. Investigations during war crimes trials established that multiple shootings of prisoners occurred along Kampfgruppe Piper's route of advance, suggesting a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Some German soldiers were convicted and executed. Others received prison sentences. Piper himself served time, but was eventually released. The immediate consequence in December 1944 was rage. American units encountering SS troops took fewer prisoners. German soldiers attempting to surrender were sometimes shot. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and adherence to the laws of war, while their soldiers demanded vengeance for murdered comrades. The battle's brutality intensified, both sides fighting with reduced willingness to show mercy. Civilians caught in the battle zone paid the price. Villages became battlefields, where surrender and retreat were replaced by fight-to-the-death resistance. Belgian civilians, sheltering in cellars, found themselves trapped between armies that showed less restraint, less willingness to pause for humanitarian concerns. Casualties among non-combatants rose as the battle's moral boundaries eroded. The massacre also stiffened American resolve strategically. News of Malmedy reached troops across the front within days, soldiers writing in diaries, officers briefing units, rumors spreading faster than official reports. The psychological effect was galvanizing. Units that might have retreated fought harder. Defenders holding road junctions understood that surrender was not an option. The battle became existential in a way it hadn't been before, not just about ground or objectives, but about survival against an enemy willing to murder prisoners. At Ardennes, snow eventually covered the bodies. American graves registration teams returned after the battle to recover remains, documenting wounds and identifying soldiers where possible. The field became a temporary cemetery before bodies were moved to permanent burial sites. Local Belgians placed a memorial at the crossroads, a monument that still stands, commemorating soldiers murdered while defenseless. The massacre entered history as one of the war's documented atrocities. It was neither the largest nor the only such incident. War crimes occurred on multiple fronts, committed by multiple armies, but Malmedy became symbolic because it was so clearly documented, so obviously unjustifiable, and so thoroughly witnessed by survivors who could testify. The trials that followed the war used Ardennes as a case study in military criminality evidence that ideology and training could create soldiers willing to murder unarmed men. For the Battle of the Bulge, Malmedy meant that mercy became a luxury neither side could afford. The fight intensified, casualties mounted, and the moral weight of the war settled heavier on soldiers who had seen too much and forgiven too little. Street 5th sat where 6 roads converged, a market town built around a rail junction that had connected Belgium to Germany for generations. In December 1944, those roads and rails made Street 5th strategically vital. German forces needed the town to move armor west toward the Meuse. Every road running through the Ardennes funneled through a handful of junctions, and Street 5th controlled the central network. Capture it, and German columns gained mobility. Lose it, and the offensive bogged down in traffic jams that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. American forces recognized the same logic. Higher command ordered Street 5th held at all costs, not because the town itself mattered, but because every hour it remained in American hands was an hour German armor spent, stalled on narrow roads, burning fuel, and falling further behind schedule. The defense of Street 5th became a deliberate sacrifice by time with blood and rubble. The defenders arrived piecemeal starting December 17th. Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division reached the town first, having driven south through refugee-clogged roads from rest areas in Holland. They were exhausted before the battle started, drivers falling asleep at the wheel, tankers functioning on coffee and adrenaline. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division arrived from the south, Survivors of the 106th Infantry Division's 424th Regiment took positions on the southern approach. Engineers, service troops, and stragglers from shattered units were pressed into the defensive line. Command was improvised. Brigadier General Robert Hasbrouck, commanding the 7th Armored, found himself coordinating units from 3 different divisions, plus independent battalions and artillery groups. Nobody had worked together before. Radio frequencies didn't match. Supply arrangements were ad hoc, but the position had to hold. So soldiers dug in and prepared for the assault they knew was coming. German forces attacked from multiple directions starting December 18th. Units from the 5th Panzer Army, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division, 116th Panzer Division, and the 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier Divisions, converged on Street Vith from the east, north, and south. Each division attacked when it arrived, without waiting for a coordinated assault. The result was a series of uncoordinated attacks that American defenders defeated in detail. The town's layout favored defense. Street Vith's buildings were stone, thick-walled structures that resisted artillery and provided cover for anti-tank guns. Defenders positioned guns to cover road approaches, using buildings as shields and firing from positions German tank commanders couldn't see until too late. German armor trying to enter the town ran into ambushes at point-blank range, 75mm and 90mm guns, firing into side armor from alleys and courtyards. Infantry fighting was house-to-house brutality. German assault troops moved through streets under covering fire from tanks and self-propelled guns. American defenders fought from upper floors and cellars, using grenades and automatic weapons to turn every building into a strongpoint. When a building became untenable, defenders fell back to the next block, maintaining a continuous line that German infantry had to fight through rather than bypass. Artillery dominated both sides' tactics. American artillery, 105mm and 155mm howitzers, positioned west of town, fired defensive concentrations onto German assembly areas and approach routes. German artillery pounded the town itself, collapsing buildings and creating rubble that slowed American movement, but also provided cover. The constant shelling made resupply dangerous and casualty evacuation nearly impossible. Aid stations operated in cellars, treating wounded by candlelight, while the ground shook from impacts above. Casualties mounted steadily. American tankers lost vehicles to German anti-tank fire, and Panzerfausts fired from close range. Infantry took losses from artillery, small arms fire, and the simple exhaustion of continuous combat in freezing temperatures. German losses were equally severe. Attacking prepared positions was a meat grinder, and the tight urban terrain negated German advantages in armor and maneuver. By December 21st, Street Vith's situation was deteriorating. German forces had nearly encircled the town. Roads west were under artillery interdiction, not cut entirely, but dangerous enough that supply convoys took heavy losses trying to reach the defenders. Ammunition was running low. Fuel for the remaining tanks was scarce. Food was cold rations eaten in frozen foxholes. Water froze in canteens. Soldiers went days without sleep, rotating between fighting positions and brief collapses into unconsciousness. Higher command, authorized withdrawal. Field Marshal Montgomery, temporarily commanding Allied forces north of the German penetration, concluded that Street Vith had served its purpose. The town had delayed German forces for 5 critical days, 5 days during which American reinforcements moved into blocking positions further west. 5 days German armor spent fighting for a road junction instead of racing toward the Meuse. Holding longer risked losing the entire garrison to encirclement. On the night of December 21st through 22nd, American forces began withdrawing. The retreat was conducted under darkness, with units pulling back in sequence, while rear guards maintained defensive fire to conceal the movement. German artillery interdicted withdrawal routes, destroying vehicles and forcing soldiers to abandon equipment. Some units became separated in the confusion, and had to navigate cross-country to reach American lines. Fighting continued through the night brief. Vicious encounters between retreating Americans and pursuing Germans in snow-covered forests. By December 23rd, Street Vith was in German hands. German troops occupied the ruins, buildings collapsed by artillery, streets littered with destroyed vehicles and debris. Civilians emerged from cellars, traumatized and hungry, finding their town transformed into a wasteland. German engineers began clearing roads to allow follow-on forces to advance, but the delay had been catastrophic for offensive timetables. The defense of Streetvith cost the Germans more than territory. 5 days of combat consumed fuel, ammunition, and irreplaceable veteran troops. Armor that should have been crossing the Meuse by December 20th was instead fighting house to house in a Belgian market town. Supply columns that should have been moving west were stalled in traffic jams created by the Streetvith bottleneck. The offensive's momentum, already damaged by delays at Lanzerath and Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis, was fracturing completely. American forces who withdrew from Streetvith established new positions 10 miles west. They were exhausted, under strength, and low on everything except determination. But they had accomplished their mission. Streetvith had held long enough. The German offensive was running out of time, and time was the one resource Germany couldn't capture. Behind the lines, American commanders studied maps and saw the shape of the battle clarifying. German penetration was deep but narrow. The offensive had created a bulge in Allied lines, hence the battle's eventual name, but the bulge wasn't breaking through. It was stalling against road junctions, fuel shortages, and American units that refused to collapse. If the weather cleared and Allied air power returned, the German columns strung out on narrow roads would be massacred. The question was whether the weather would clear in time. Bastogne was ordinary, a town of 4,000 people sitting where 7 roads met in rolling farmland. Those roads made it extraordinary. Every major route through the southern Ardennes ran through Bastogne. Roads from Luxembourg, Streetvith, Houffalize, Marché, Neufchâteau, Arlon. They all intersected at Bastogne's central square. Control those roads, and you controlled movement across an entire sector. Lose Bastogne, and armies could maneuver freely. Hold it, and those armies were forced onto secondary roads that couldn't handle heavy traffic. German planners understood this perfectly. The 5th Panzer Army's operational plan called for capturing Bastogne by December 18th, then using its road network to push armor west toward Dinant and the Meuse. The town wasn't supposed to be a battle. German intelligence suggested it was lightly held by service troops and could be taken in a quick assault or bypassed entirely if necessary. Intelligence was wrong. On December 18th, the first American reinforcements rolled into Bastogne Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, diverted north from Patton's 3rd Army. They numbered roughly 4,000 soldiers with tanks, tank destroyers, and armored infantry. Not a large force, but experienced and mechanized. They took up positions east and north of town, blocking the most direct approaches. Hours later, the 101st Airborne Division arrived. The 101st had been resting near Reims, France, when orders came to move north immediately. The division loaded onto trucks in a chaos of hurried packing soldiers, grabbing weapons and ammunition but leaving behind cold weather gear, heavy equipment, even some officers who were away on leave. The convoy drove through the night, headlights off, guided by moonlight and the distant glow of burning villages. By the morning of December 19th, roughly 11,000 paratroopers were unloading in Bastogne streets. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, established his headquarters in a Belgian army barracks in the town center. His first assessment was grim. Bastogne was surrounded on 3 sides by advancing German forces. American units to the east were retreating in disorder. Refugees clogged the roads, and the 101st had arrived without its regular commander, without adequate ammunition reserves, and without clear orders beyond hold Bastogne. McAuliffe made the only decision that made sense: prepare for siege. Engineers began laying defensive barriers on roads leading into town. Infantry dug foxholes in frozen ground around Bastogne's perimeter, forming a circular defensive line roughly 4 miles in diameter. Artillery crews, multiple battalions from units separated from their parent divisions, registered defensive fires onto likely approach routes. Tank destroyers positioned at key intersections, ready to engage German armor at close range. The civilian population complicated everything. 4,000 Belgian civilians still lived in Bastogne, and more were arriving daily refugees, fleeing villages overrun by German forces. The town had to shelter, feed, and protect non-combatants while preparing for battle. Cellars became shelters. Churches opened their doors. Schools and public buildings filled with families carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. American soldiers shared rations with hungry children and tried to reassure terrified adults in broken French. German forces approached from multiple directions. The 2nd Panzer Division moved toward Bastogne from the northeast, probing defenses and looking for weak points. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the east. The Panzerlehr Division approached from the south. These units weren't coordinating, each arrived at different times and attacked independently, giving American defenders the advantage of defeating attacks in sequence rather than simultaneously. The first serious assault came on December 19th. German infantry, supported by armor-hit positions, held by the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B east of town. The fight was close range, and brutal American tank destroyers knocked out Panthers at ranges measured in yards, while German infantry tried to infiltrate through woods and seize roadblocks from behind. American paratroopers reinforced the line, moving through artillery fire to reach threatened sectors. The defense held, but the perimeter shrank. By December 20th, German forces had pushed closer to Bastogne from all directions except southwest, where the road to Neufchâteau remained tenuously open. American wounded were evacuated down that road, while supply trucks moved north, racing against time and German flanking movements that threatened to cut the corridor. Artillery became the battle's constant soundtrack. German guns pounded Bastogne throughout the day and night, not massed barrages, but methodical harassment fire designed to prevent sleep, disrupt supply operations, and kill a few soldiers with each volley. American artillery responded, firing defensive concentrations onto German assembly areas and interdicting roads German forces were using to move troops forward. Casualties accumulated on both sides. American aid stations filled with wounded shrapnel injuries, gunshot wounds, frostbite cases severe enough to require evacuation. Medics worked in cellars and barns, treating casualties by candlelight, rationing morphine and plasma. German casualties were equally heavy, though exact numbers remained unknown. Attacking fortified positions in winter was a meat grinder infantry suffering from exposure and defensive fire, armor vulnerable to concealed anti-tank weapons. On December 20th, the southwest corridor closed. German forces from the Panzerlehr Division seized the road to Neufchâteau, completing Bastogne's encirclement. The town was now cut off. No ground supply, no evacuation route, no reinforcement, except by air. McAuliffe radioed higher command, confirming the situation. 101st Airborne and attached units were surrounded. Supplies were limited, and unless relieved within days, the garrison would run out of ammunition and medical supplies. Higher command's response was blunt. Hold Bastogne. Help was coming. Patton's Third Army was being redirected north for a relief operation. Airdrops would provide emergency supplies if weather permitted, but the garrison had to hold until relief arrived, and nobody could say when that would be. McAuliffe acknowledged the order and turned to the practical problem of survival. Ammunition was rationed immediately. Artillery battalions were ordered to conserve shells, fire only defensive concentrations against confirmed attacks, no harassment fire, no registration missions, unless absolutely necessary. Infantry were told to aim carefully and make every bullet count. Machine gunners calculated ammunition consumption rates and set strict daily limits. Tank commanders preserved main gun rounds for enemy armor, relying on machine guns for infantry targets. Food was less critical but still concerning. The garrison had perhaps 5 days of rations at normal consumption, longer if meals were reduced. Soldiers ate cold sea rations in foxholes, supplemented by whatever local supplies could be requisitioned from Belgian civilians. Some units organized communal meals in cellars, heating rations over small fires and sharing equally. Hunger was manageable, at least initially. Cold was the more immediate enemy. December temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. Soldiers in foxholes wrapped themselves in blankets, salvaged coats, and anything else that might retain warmth. Frostbite became epidemic: fingers, toes, ears turning white then black as tissue died from exposure. Medical officers treated hundreds of frostbite cases daily, knowing that many would lose fingers or toes to amputation. Soldiers rotated between positions and warming shelters where fires could be maintained without drawing German artillery. German forces attacked the perimeter daily. Probing attacks tested American defenses, looking for weak sectors or positions that might be overrun in a sudden assault. Each attack was met with concentrated defensive fire artillery. Mortars, machine guns, and rifles coordinated to create kill zones that German infantry had to cross under fire. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the perimeter held. Inside Bastogne, McAuliffe maintained iron discipline. Officers circulated constantly, checking positions, reassuring troops, and maintaining morale. Rumors were quashed immediately. No, relief wasn't arriving today. No, the Germans weren't offering surrender terms. No, the situation wasn't hopeless. The message was consistent: hold the line, conserve ammunition, wait for relief. Morale was surprisingly high. The 101st Airborne had fought in Normandy and Holland. They were veteran soldiers who understood that tough situations were survivable if everyone did their job. The knowledge that Patton's Third Army was driving north to relieve them provided psychological support. Help was coming. They just had to hold until it arrived. Civilians trapped in Bastogne endured their own siege. Families sheltered in cellars, listening to artillery impacts and praying for survival. Some cellars housed 50 or more people, multiple families crammed into spaces designed for a single household's winter coal supply. Sanitation was primitive. Food was scarce. Fear was constant. Belgian civilians shared what little they had with American soldiers, and soldiers reciprocated when possible, creating bonds of shared survival. By December 21st, Bastogne had been surrounded for over 24 hours. The perimeter held, ammunition was adequate, morale remained solid, but the weather was still terrible, heavy clouds and fog preventing aerial resupply. American aircraft sat grounded on French airfields, crews waiting for visibility that never came. The garrison was on its own, counting shells and watching the roads for German attacks or American relief columns. Neither arrived. The siege tightened, and the weather stayed grey. The perimeter around Bastogne was a rough circle, foxholes, roadblocks, and strongpoints arranged in a defensive arc roughly 4 miles across. It was never continuous. Gaps existed between positions, forests too thick to defend completely, draws where visibility dropped to yards, sectors where thinly stretched units had to choose which approach to watch and which to risk. German forces probed these gaps constantly, infiltrating small groups through American lines to gather intelligence, cut communication wires, and spread confusion. American defenders adapted to siege warfare quickly. Patrols moved between positions at night, maintaining contact between units and challenging anyone moving in the dark. Passwords changed daily. Soldiers learned to identify the sound of German equipment, the particular clatter of MP-40 submachine guns, the diesel rumble of German trucks, the metallic squeak of Panther suspensions. Listening became as important as watching. German attacks intensified on December 21st. Multiple assaults hit the perimeter from different directions, not simultaneous, but close enough in timing that reserves couldn't shift to meet each threat. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the northeast, supported by assault guns. German infantry moved through fog, getting close to American positions before defensive fire erupted. Machine guns swept the ground. Mortar rounds dropped among advancing infantry. Artillery fire called by forward observers, crashed into German assembly areas. The attack was repulsed, but it cost ammunition. American artillery battalions fired hundreds of shells in defensive missions, concentrations that broke up German assaults, but depleted stockpiles faster than resupply could replace them. Battalion commanders requested ammunition restrictions be loosened. McAuliffe's headquarters denied the requests. Ammunition had to last until relief arrived, or aerial resupply became possible. Every shell fired was a shell that wouldn't be available tomorrow. Infantry ammunition was similarly precious. Riflemen were ordered to fire single shots, not bursts. Machine gunners calculated how many seconds of sustained fire their remaining ammunition would support and adjusted tactics accordingly. Short bursts instead of continuous fire, aimed shots instead of suppression. Soldiers collected ammunition from casualties, American and German scavenging bullets and grenades wherever they could be found. Food supplies were holding but degrading. The garrison had enough rations for several more days, but distribution was complicated by German artillery fire that made movement dangerous. Supply dumps were dispersed to prevent a single shell from destroying concentrated stocks. Soldiers picked up rations from collection points and carried them forward to fighting positions, moving during lulls in shelling and hoping German observers didn't spot them. Medical supplies were becoming critical. Plasma for treating shock was running low. Morphine was rationed, strictly used only for the most severe pain, withheld from less critical cases. Bandages were washed and reused. Surgical instruments were sterilized repeatedly until they were dull from sharpening. Aid stations operated continuously, treating a steady stream of wounded while bracing for mass casualty events if German assaults penetrated the perimeter. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. Soldiers who spent days in frozen foxholes without adequate winter clothing suffered tissue damage that required evacuation and treatment. But evacuation was impossible. The town was surrounded. No roads led out. Frostbite victims were treated where they were, feet and hands bandaged, then returned to positions because every rifle mattered. Some men would lose toes or fingers to post-battle amputation, but for now, they stayed on the line. Civilians suffering paralleled military hardship. Belgian families in Bastogne's cellars endured cold, hunger, and fear without the psychological framework. Soldiers had no chain of command, no mission to focus on, no understanding of why their town had become a battlefield. Children cried from hunger and cold. Parents tried to maintain normalcy, telling stories and singing songs to distract from the thunder above. Some civilians helped American soldiers, guiding them through town, translating when necessary, sharing what little food remained. German propaganda joined artillery as a siege weapon. Loudspeakers, positioned outside the perimeter, broadcast messages in English, claims that American forces elsewhere had been destroyed, that relief wasn't coming, that surrender was the only rational option. Most American soldiers ignored the broadcasts or laughed at them. A few found the messages unsettling, not because they believed them, but because they highlighted the isolation Bastogne was cut off, and nobody outside could tell them what was really happening. Communication with higher command was sporadic. Radio contact required careful antenna positioning and power conservation. Messages were brief, situation reports, ammunition status, casualty counts. Responses from Corps and Army headquarters were equally terse. Hold your positions, relief is coming, air resupply will arrive when weather clears. The lack of detail was frustrating but understandable. Higher command had its own problems, coordinating reinforcements, redirecting Patton's army, managing the entire Ardennes crisis. On December 22nd, German forces delivered a formal surrender demand. A German officer approached American lines under a white flag, carrying a typed message addressed to the American commander. The message was polite and formal. German forces had surrounded Bastogne completely. Further resistance was futile, and to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, the garrison should surrender honorably. 2 hours were given for a response. McAuliffe's reply entered military legend. After reading the surrender demand, McAuliffe's first response was unprintable, a single-word profanity expressing his opinion of the German offer. His staff suggested something more formal might be appropriate for an official reply. McAuliffe considered, then dictated a one-word answer: nuts. The message was typed, signed, and delivered to the waiting German officer. The German officer was confused by the slang. American officers explained that nuts meant the same thing as go to hell. The demand was rejected. The garrison would not surrender. The battle would continue. The German officer accepted the reply and returned to his lines. German artillery resumed shortly afterward, heavier than before, as if responding to the rejection with increased firepower. The psychological impact was enormous. Word of McAuliffe's response spread through the garrison. Within hours, soldiers laughing, morale lifting, the defiant absurdity of nuts becoming a rallying cry. American troops who had spent days cold, hungry, and shelled appreciated the dark humor. It confirmed that leadership wasn't broken, that the situation, while serious, wasn't desperate, and that surrender was never an option being considered. German forces attacked again on December 22nd afternoon. This time, the assault came from the northwest German infantry and armor trying to break through toward the town center. American defenders responded with everything available: artillery, mortars, anti-tank guns, and small arms fire. The German attack penetrated the outer defenses, but stalled under concentrated fire. Tank destroyers engaged German armor at close range, knocking out assault guns and forcing infantry to take cover. The battle lasted hours. American soldiers fought from foxholes and buildings, retreating when positions became untenable, counterattacking when German forces paused to reorganize. The fight was fluid and chaotic, small units making decisions based on immediate threats rather than coordinated plans. Leadership was decentralized by necessity, lieutenants and sergeants leading squads and platoons without waiting for orders from higher command. By evening, the German attack had been defeated, but the cost was severe. American casualties included dead, wounded, and soldiers simply exhausted beyond function. Ammunition stockpiles dropped further. Artillery battalions reported critically low shell counts. Infantry companies counted remaining bullets and realized they had perhaps one or two more major engagements before running dry. The weather remained Germany's greatest ally. Heavy clouds, fog, and occasional snow kept Allied aircraft grounded. Without air resupply, Bastogne's garrison was slowly bleeding to death, not from German attacks, but from simple attrition. Food would last several more days. Ammunition might last through one or two more major assaults. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Fuel for vehicles was almost gone, forcing tanks and trucks to sit idle. Inside the perimeter, soldiers prepared for another night. Sentries posted, foxholes reinforced, ammunition redistributed. Officers checked positions and encouraged troops. Medics treated the day's wounded. Civilians huddled in cellars, praying for survival. And somewhere to the south, Patton's Third Army was driving north through winter conditions and German resistance, racing to reach Bastogne before the garrison collapsed. But nobody in Bastogne knew when or if relief would arrive. They only knew they had to hold another day. The message itself was brief, 4 letters, 1 syllable: absolute defiance. But its impact spread far beyond Bastogne's frozen perimeter. When word of McAuliffe's reply reached American units across the Ardennes, the response was electric. Soldiers who had spent a week fighting in brutal conditions, retreating from German advances, and wondering whether the offensive might actually succeed, suddenly had a symbol of resistance, a one-word message that said the line was holding, that American forces weren't broken, that the answer to German surrender demands was unprintable contempt. Radio operators shared the story across military networks. Within hours, troops in foxholes miles from Bastogne knew about nuts. Officers repeated it when addressing soldiers. The message became shorthand for the entire defense, not just Bastogne, but the American refusal to collapse under the weight of Germany's last offensive. Psychological warfare worked both directions. German intelligence learned of McAuliffe's response through captured documents and prisoner interrogations. The reaction was mixed. Some German officers respected the defiance as soldierly conduct under difficult circumstances. Others saw it as foolish bravado from forces that didn't understand how hopeless their situation was. German propaganda broadcasts tried to spin the message as proof that American commanders were reckless with their soldiers' lives, ordering them to fight hopeless battles rather than accept honorable surrender. American soldiers weren't convinced. The men defending Bastogne understood their situation surrounded, low on supplies, dependent on relief that hadn't arrived. But they also understood that they were holding a critical objective, that German forces needed Bastogne's roads, and that every day the garrison held was another day German armor couldn't maneuver freely. The mission made sense, even if the conditions were miserable. Morale inside the perimeter remained surprisingly stable. Soldiers dealt with siege conditions using dark humor, small rituals, and the camaraderie of shared hardship. Foxhole conversations turned to home, to meals they missed, to plans for after the war. Some soldiers wrote letters they couldn't mail, messages intended for families, but written more as psychological anchors, ways to maintain connection to a world beyond frozen Belgium. Others focused on immediate survival. Soldiers shared body heat in crowded foxholes, rotating who slept and who stayed awake. They scrounged materials to improve positions, lumber scavenged from damaged buildings, doors used as overhead cover, bricks stacked to create windbreaks. Small improvements made life marginally more bearable. A few degrees warmer, slightly less wind, a position that allowed sitting instead of constant standing. Food became a focus of conversation and creativity. Sea rations were monotonous canned meat, crackers, instant coffee. Soldiers traded components, seeking variety even when all the options were equally unappetizing. Some units pooled rations to create communal meals, heating cans over small fires and sharing equally. Belgian civilians occasionally contributed bread baked in stone ovens, vegetables from root cellars, milk from cows somehow still alive despite the shelling. Ammunition conservation required constant discipline. Machine gunners counted rounds remaining and calculated how many seconds of fire each belt represented. Riflemen checked their bandoliers and made mental notes: 8 rounds left, enough for 2 encounters if shots were carefully aimed. Artillery crews tracked shells like miser's gold, recording each round fired and updating running totals of what remained. Mortar teams preserved ammunition for defensive fires, refusing to waste rounds on targets that infantry could engage with rifles. The defenders developed routines that created psychological structure. Morning stand to everyone awake and alert during the hour before dawn when attacks were most likely. Afternoon position checks, officers moving through the perimeter, inspecting foxholes, and maintaining personal contact with soldiers. Evening briefings, situation updates passed down from headquarters, usually containing no new information, but providing reassurance that command was still functioning. Night watches, rotating sentries, challenge and password protocols, listening for movement in the darkness. German forces maintained pressure without launching major assaults. Artillery fire continued throughout December 22nd, not massed barrages, but steady harassment that prevented sleep and killed randomly. Shells landed on roads, in courtyards, near aid stations. Some caused casualties. Most just created noise and fear. The psychological impact was cumulative: soldiers learning to live with constant low-level threat, flinching at sounds but not panicking, accepting danger as the normal condition of existence. Infiltration attempts probed the perimeter's integrity. Small German teams moved through gaps in American lines, trying to reach the town center or cut communication wires connecting defensive positions. American patrols hunted these infiltrators, brief, violent encounters in darkness, where recognition was uncertain and survival depended on shooting first. Bodies accumulated in no man's land. German and American soldiers killed in night fighting, left where they fell because retrieval was too dangerous. Medical personnel worked without pause. Aid stations treated a steady flow of casualties, combat wounds, frostbite, exhaustion, illness. Surgeons operated by candlelight when electric generators ran out of fuel. Nurses, army nurses, who had been trapped in Bastogne when the encirclement closed, worked shifts that lasted until they collapsed from exhaustion. Supplies dwindled despite careful rationing. Bandages were washed and reused. Instruments were sterilized and shared between surgeries. Morphine doses were calculated to minimum effective levels. Civilian medical needs complicated the situation. Belgian civilians injured by shelling needed treatment, but military medical supplies were reserved for soldiers. The ethical dilemma was constant help civilians and reduce supplies available for troops, or refuse treatment and watch non-combatants suffer. Most medical personnel found middle grounds, treating civilian emergencies when possible, triaging ruthlessly when supplies were critically low, and struggling with decisions that had no good answers. Communication with the outside world remained limited. Radio contact with Corps headquarters was sporadic, brief exchanges, confirming bastions still held, reporting ammunition status, requesting air resupply when weather permitted. Messages from higher command were encouraging but vague. Hold on. Relief is coming. Patton is moving north. No specific timelines, no guarantees, just orders to continue the defense. The lack of information created uncertainty. Soldiers defending the perimeter didn't know the larger battle's status. They didn't know whether German forces were advancing elsewhere, whether Allied lines were holding, whether the Ardennes offensive was succeeding or failing. Their world had contracted to the immediate, the foxhole they occupied, the sector they defended, the soldiers in adjacent positions. Everything beyond that was rumor and speculation, but nuts provided clarity. The message confirmed that resistance was the plan, that higher command wasn't considering withdrawal or surrender, that the garrison's job was to hold until relieved. The simplicity was reassuring. No complex decisions, no moral ambiguity, just a clear mission, executed under difficult conditions. As night fell on December 22nd, the defense continued. Soldiers stood watch in frozen darkness, scanning for movement, listening for engines or voices. Artillery fire punctuated the night at irregular intervals. Wounded men groaned in aid stations. Civilians prayed in cellars. And somewhere to the south, unseen and unheard, Patton's Third Army was grinding north through German resistance and winter storms. The answer remained nuts, defiant, absurd, and absolute. The morning of December 23rd dawned clear. For the first time in a week, heavy clouds broke apart, revealing blue sky and winter sunlight that turned snow-covered fields brilliant white. Soldiers in foxholes around Bastogne looked up and saw what they'd been waiting for: conditions that would bring Allied aircraft back into the battle. The weather shift changed everything. Across Allied air bases in France, Belgium, and England, crews scrambled to launch aircraft that had been grounded since December 16th. Fighter bombers were armed and fueled. Transport planes were loaded with supply bundles, ammunition, medical supplies, food. Glider pilots prepared for what would become one of the most dangerous resupply missions of the war. The first aircraft appeared over Bastogne around mid-morning. C-47 transport planes, flying in formation, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, approached the surrounded town at low altitude. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from German positions, tracer rounds arcing toward the transports, flak bursts creating black clouds around the formations. The C-47s maintained course, bomb bay doors opening, bundles tumbling out into space. Parachutes bloomed, hundreds of them, colored fabric floating down toward the perimeter. American soldiers cheered from foxholes, watching supplies descend. Some parachutes landed inside the perimeter, perfect drops that fell into American-controlled areas where recovery teams could gather them immediately. Others drifted outside the lines, landing in no man's land or German-held territory. Soldiers risked their lives to recover these bundles, sprinting across open ground under fire to drag parachutes back to American positions. The supplies were treasure. Ammunition dominated the loads. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, small arms cartridges. Each bundle also contained medical supplies, plasma, bandages, morphine, and rations to supplement dwindling food stocks. Recovery teams sorted supplies by priority, distributing artillery ammunition to gun batteries first, then medical supplies to aid stations. then everything else according to need. German forces tried to interdict the airdrops. Anti-aircraft guns engaged transport planes, forcing them to fly through walls of flak that damaged aircraft and killed crew members. Fighter aircraft attempted to intercept the resupply flights, leading to dogfights over Bastogne. American P-47s engaging German fighters, while C-47s continued their runs. Some transport planes were shot down, spiraling to crash in fields outside the perimeter. Others limped back to base, trailing smoke, airframes riddled with holes. But the mission succeeded. Over December 23rd and 24th, Allied aircraft delivered roughly 150 tons of supplies to Bastogne's defenders. Not everything dropped, reached American hands. Wind drift and German fire caused losses, but enough arrived to stabilize the garrison's ammunition situation and restock medical supplies. The psychological impact was equally important. The sight of Allied aircraft overhead confirmed that Bastogne wasn't forgotten, that higher command was fighting to sustain the defense. Fighter bombers turned their attention to German forces surrounding the town. P-47, Thunderbolts, and RAF Typhoons attacked German armor and supply columns, diving from altitude to strafe vehicles with 50 caliber machine guns and rockets. German columns that had moved freely during a week of bad weather now paid the price. Tanks burning on roads, trucks exploding, infantry scattering for cover. The attacks disrupted German logistics, forcing supply convoys to move only at night and creating ammunition shortages for German units besieging Bastogne. Medium bombers joined the air campaign. B-26 Marauders struck German positions around Bastogne, dropping bombs on assembly areas, artillery positions, and road junctions. The bombing was less precise than fighter-bomber attacks. Accuracy from medium altitude in winter conditions was poor, but the weight of explosives compensated for imprecision. German troops experienced what Allied forces had endured for a week: constant threat from above, nowhere to hide, attacks that came without warning. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest Allied air superiority. German fighters engaged Allied aircraft over the Ardennes, leading to air battles that scattered across Belgian and Luxembourg skies. The Luftwaffe was outmatched. Allied numerical superiority, better trained pilots, and operational experience from years of strategic bombing gave American and British aircraft decisive advantages. German fighters scored occasional victories but couldn't prevent Allied aircraft from dominating the battlefield. For German ground forces, clear skies meant catastrophe. Armor that had advanced under cloud cover was now exposed. Columns moving during daylight were targeted within minutes. German commanders were forced to halt daylight operations, moving only at night when Allied aircraft couldn't effectively engage. The operational tempo slowed, advances measured in yards rather than miles. Supply movements delayed until darkness. Offensive pressure relaxed as German units focused on survival rather than attack. Inside Bastogne, the mood shifted from endurance to hope. Supplies had arrived. Aircraft overhead meant the battle had turned in favor of Allied air power, and rumors spread through the perimeter. Patton's Third Army was driving north. Relief columns were approaching. Breakthrough might be hours away. The rumors weren't quite accurate. Relief was still days away, but hope itself was a resource that sustained soldiers through another night of cold and shelling. December 24th brought continued air operations. More supply drops, more fighter bomber attacks, more medium bomber strikes. The sky filled with contrails and flak bursts. Aircraft noise became constant: engines, explosions, the whistle of bombs falling. German anti-aircraft fire intensified, shooting down more Allied planes but unable to stop the aerial onslaught. Christmas Eve, inside Bastogne, was surreal. Soldiers in foxholes listened to distant church bells ringing from villages beyond the battle zone. Some units held brief religious services, chaplains leading prayers in cellars while artillery rumbled above. Belgian civilians celebrated quietly in shelters, trying to maintain traditions despite circumstances that made celebration absurd. A few American soldiers sang carols, voices rough from cold and exhaustion, words trailing off into uncomfortable silence. The garrison received a Christmas message from higher command. McAuliffe's headquarters broadcast a brief statement to all units. Relief was approaching, the defense had been magnificent, and every soldier's effort had contributed to holding a vital objective. The message was read aloud in command posts and fighting positions. Some soldiers appreciated the recognition. Others were too cold and tired to care about praise. They wanted relief, not compliments. That night, Allied aircraft flew one more mission over Bastogne. Bomber crews, operating on Christmas Eve, delivered supplies and struck German positions around the perimeter. The flights were dangerous darkness, winter weather, and anti-aircraft fire, creating conditions that tested pilot skill and courage. Some aircraft didn't return, others landed with battle damage that required immediate repair. But the mission demonstrated commitment. Allied command was willing to risk crews and aircraft to sustain Bastogne's defense. As Christmas morning approached, the situation remained precarious. The garrison had supplies for several more days of combat. Ammunition was adequate if used carefully. Morale was holding, but German forces still surrounded the town. Relief hadn't arrived, and nobody knew whether Patton's drive would succeed or bog down like every other offensive in the Ardennes. The sky had opened, bringing hope and firepower. Whether it would bring victory remained uncertain. George S. Patton's Third Army was driving toward the Saar when orders came to pivot 90 degrees north. The maneuver was operationally audacious and logistically nightmarish. Third Army consisted of roughly 250,000 soldiers, organized into multiple corps. The 3rd Corps, 8th Corps, and 12th Corps spread across a front in eastern France and Luxembourg. Those forces were oriented east, pushing toward the German border, supplied through routes running north to south. Pivoting north meant redirecting entire divisions, reorienting supply lines, and coordinating movement through winter conditions over roads that were already inadequate for normal traffic. Patton accepted the mission with characteristic confidence. On December 19th, at a meeting with Eisenhower and other senior commanders, Patton promised to have 3 divisions moving north within 72 hours. Other generals considered the timeline optimistic to the point of fantasy. Redirecting corps-size formations required days of planning, not hours. Patton insisted it was achievable because he had already ordered staff to prepare contingency plans for exactly this scenario. The contingency planning proved accurate. Third Army staff had anticipated that German attacks elsewhere might require rapid redeployment. They had sketched movement plans, identified routes, and calculated logistical requirements. When orders came to move north, staff converted sketches into formal operation orders within hours. Units received movement instructions by December 20th. The 1st Divisions began marching north on December 21st. The movement was organized around 3 parallel routes. Each corps moved along separate roads to prevent congestion. The 4th Armored Division led 3rd Corps' advance, moving north from Luxembourg toward Bastogne via Arlon. The 26th Infantry Division advanced on a parallel route to the east. The 80th Infantry Division moved on another axis, creating a 3-pronged attack toward the southern edge of the German penetration. Every mile presented obstacles. Roads were icy, narrow, and clogged with refugee traffic moving south away from combat zones. Engineers worked continuously to maintain routes, clearing snow, repairing bridges damaged by German demolitions or Allied bombing, and organizing traffic control at critical intersections. Military police directed convoys, preventing the gridlock that would occur if units tried to move without coordination. Supply was the constant challenge. Ammunition trucks had to keep pace with advancing divisions. Fuel tankers struggled on icy roads, sometimes taking hours to travel distances that should have required minutes. Rations were distributed from mobile supply points established as the advance progressed. Maintenance teams followed combat units, repairing vehicles that broke down and recovering those too damaged to fix. Weather worked against every operation. Freezing rain created ice-slicked roads where trucks skidded and overturned. Snow reduced visibility and made navigation difficult. Cold, strained vehicles, engines that wouldn't start, batteries that died overnight, hydraulic systems that froze solid. Soldiers worked in conditions that made every task harder. fingers too numb to handle ammunition, feet painful from constant cold, exhaustion compounded by inadequate shelter. German forces contested the advance from the beginning. Rearguard units, German infantry and anti-tank teams, assigned to slow American movement, established defensive positions at towns, bridges, and road junctions. Each position had to be cleared through direct assault infantry supported by tanks, artillery preparation followed by close combat. Progress was measured in hours per mile. Villages taken after fierce fighting that left buildings burning and streets littered with destroyed vehicles. The 4th Armored Division led the advance with aggressive tactics. Combat Command A and Combat Command B moved on parallel routes, leapfrogging forward in a pattern that maintained constant pressure on German defenders. When one combat command encountered resistance, the other attempted to bypass and continue advancing. Tank commanders pushed forward relentlessly, accepting casualties as the price of maintaining momentum. Patton's command style emphasized speed and aggression. He visited forward units daily, driving to headquarters just behind the front line and demanding updates on progress. His questions were direct. How many miles advanced today? What's blocking further movement? When will you reach the next objective? Commanders who reported slow progress faced sharp criticism. Those who showed initiative and aggression received praise and support. The advance wasn't linear or clean. Units bypassed some German positions, leaving them for follow-on forces to reduce. Other strong points had to be destroyed immediately because they controlled critical roads. The result was a messy battlefield where front lines were unclear, where German and American units intermingled, and where navigation required constant reference to maps and compasses. By December 24th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were within 4 miles of Bastogne. The final approach was contested fiercely. German forces defending the corridor understood that if Patton's relief column reached Bastogne, the siege would break and the entire German offensive's southern shoulder would collapse. They fought with desperation, born of strategic necessity. Infantry dug into frozen ground, anti-tank guns positioned to cover every approach, artillery registered on roads the Americans had to use. The 4th Armored attacked through winter darkness on December 25th. Christmas Day, 1944, was spent in combat tanks advancing through snow, infantry clearing villages house by house, engineers bridging streams and craters under fire. German resistance was ferocious. Every field was contested. Every village cost casualties. But the advance continued, measured in yards and purchased with blood. On December 26th, the corridor to Bastogne finally opened. Lead tanks from the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command R reached the southern edge of Bastogne's perimeter, making contact with defenders from the 101st Airborne. The link-up was brief and businesslike, no celebrations, just confirmation that a narrow corridor now connected the besieged garrison to Patton's forces. The corridor was immediately put to use. Wounded were evacuated south on trucks and ambulances that had waited days for a route out. Supplies moved north, ammunition, food, medical equipment. Fresh troops rotated into Bastogne's defensive positions, relieving exhausted soldiers who had held the perimeter for over a week. The flow was constant but precarious. German artillery interdicted the corridor, destroying vehicles and killing soldiers moving along the narrow road. Patton's achievement was remarkable but incomplete. 3rd Army had pivoted 90 degrees, advanced nearly 30 miles through winter conditions and German resistance, and relieved Bastogne in 7 days. The operational accomplishment demonstrated staff competence, logistical capability, and tactical aggression. But the battle wasn't over. The corridor was narrow, vulnerable, and under constant threat. German forces still surrounded most of Bastogne's perimeter. The siege had been broken, but the fight continued. Inside Bastogne, relief brought exhaustion to the surface. Soldiers who had maintained discipline through a week of siege suddenly felt the weight of accumulated stress. Some broke down crying, others simply slept, collapsing where they stood, too tired to move even to better shelter. Medical personnel treated combat fatigue cases alongside physical wounds, recognizing that psychological trauma was as real as shrapnel injuries. Patton visited Bastogne on December 27th. He toured the perimeter, spoke with McAuliffe and other commanders, and addressed soldiers who had held the town. His message was characteristically direct. The defense had been magnificent. The relief was only the beginning, and Third Army would now push north to destroy German forces in the Ardennes. Soldiers received the message with mixed emotions, pride in accomplishment, exhaustion from effort, and apprehension about battles yet to come. The corridor remained open but contested. German forces launched repeated attacks, trying to cut the road between Bastogne and Arlon. Each attack was defeated, but the constant pressure required defensive forces to remain alert and committed. Supply convoys continued moving through the corridor, accepting losses as the cost of sustaining Bastogne's garrison and building strength for future operations. By December 28th, the immediate crisis had passed. Bastogne was relieved, supplied, and reinforced. The siege had cost roughly 3,000 American casualties killed, wounded, and missing. German losses around Bastogne were estimated at over 5,000, plus destroyed armor and consumed supplies that Germany couldn't replace. The strategic outcome was clear. Bastogne had held, the German offensive's timetable was shattered, and American forces were transitioning from defense to counteroffensive. But the Battle of the Bulge was far from over. The link-up happened without ceremony. A Sherman tank from the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command R rolled into Bastogne's southern perimeter shortly after 1645 on December 26. The tank commander, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, identified himself to American defenders who had been holding the position for days. Confirmation was sent up the chain of command. Contact established, corridor open, Bastogne relieved. Soldiers in foxholes didn't cheer. They were too tired, too cold, and too aware that relief didn't mean safety. The perimeter was still surrounded on 3 sides. German artillery continued shelling the town. Fighting positions still needed manning. The only difference was that a narrow road now connected Bastogne to friendly forces, and that road was under constant German fire. The corridor was immediately tested. Convoys began moving through before dark trucks loaded with ammunition and medical supplies heading north into Bastogne. Ambulances loaded with wounded heading south toward field hospitals. German artillery observers spotted the movement and called fire missions. Shells crashed onto the road, destroying vehicles and forcing convoys to halt while engineers cleared wreckage. Traffic management became critical. Military police positioned at intervals along the corridor directed vehicles, preventing jams that would create targets for German guns. Northbound and southbound traffic was coordinated to minimize congestion. Drivers learned to move quickly through sections under direct observation by German artillery, accelerating through kill zones and hoping shells would miss. Casualties among supply convoy personnel were significant. Drivers and vehicle crews died in artillery strikes that caught convoys on exposed stretches of road. Wounded drivers were replaced, damaged vehicles pushed aside, and convoys continued. The supply line had to function regardless of cost. Bastogne's garrison needed ammunition, and wounded soldiers needed evacuation. The corridor was dangerous, but it was the only route available. Inside Bastogne, the arrival of supplies transformed the tactical situation. Artillery battalions that had been rationing shells now received thousands of rounds, allowing renewed offensive fires against German positions. Infantry companies distributed fresh ammunition, filling bandoliers and magazines that had been nearly empty. Mortar teams restocked, preparing for defensive fires and counterattacks. The garrison transitioned from siege survival mode to preparing for breakout operations. Wounded soldiers were evacuated with desperate urgency. Aid stations had accumulated casualties that needed surgical treatment beyond what field medics could provide. Ambulances moved these soldiers south through the corridor, accepting artillery risk because delay meant death from infection or shock. Some ambulances were hit, vehicles destroyed, patients and medics killed. Others made it through, delivering wounded to field hospitals, where surgeons worked continuously to save lives. Fresh troops rotated into the perimeter. Units from Patton's Third Army moved north to reinforce Bastogne's defenders. bringing fresh soldiers who hadn't endured the week-long siege. These reinforcements took over portions of the defensive line, allowing exhausted soldiers from the 101st Airborne and attached units to withdraw for rest. The rotation was gradual and careful, maintaining defensive strength while giving siege veterans time to sleep, eat hot food, and receive medical attention for accumulated minor injuries. The relief of Bastogne didn't end the battle. German forces still controlled most approaches to the town. The corridor was narrow at some points, only a few hundred yards wide, and vulnerable to flanking attacks. German commanders ordered renewed efforts to cut the road and re-isolate Bastogne, understanding that an open corridor meant American reinforcements and supplies could flow freely. Attacks on the corridor began December 27. German infantry and armor struck from both sides, trying to sever the road between Bastogne and Arlon. American defenders units from the 4th Armored Division and supporting infantry fought from defensive positions along the corridor's flanks. Each German attack was met with concentrated artillery and small arms fire. Tank destroyers engaged German armor at ranges that allowed American gunners to exploit vulnerabilities in side armor. The fighting was brutal and continuous. German forces attacked repeatedly, each assault repulsed, but weakening American defensive strength. Casualties mounted on both sides. Artillery duels created landscapes of craters and destroyed vehicles. Infantry fought from frozen foxholes, trading fire with German troops across fields of snow turned muddy with blood and explosives. Inside Bastogne, Micallef's headquarters planned the next phase. Relief had been achieved, but the mission was evolving. Instead of simply holding Bastogne, American forces were now tasked with expanding the perimeter, pushing German forces back, and establishing a secure corridor that couldn't be easily cut. This required offensive operations, attacks out from Bastogne, coordinated with Patton's advance from the south. The expanded mission required fresh forces and supplies. Over the following days, more divisions moved through the corridor into Bastogne. Artillery battalions positioned around the town's perimeter, bringing concentrated firepower to support infantry attacks. Tank battalions arrived, providing armored punch for breakout operations. Engineers reinforced defensive positions and prepared routes for offensive movement. Civilian life in Bastogne began a slow, tentative return to normalcy. Belgian civilians emerged from cellars, surveying damage to homes and businesses. Some buildings were completely destroyed, collapsed by artillery, or burned in fighting. Others showed damage, but remained habitable. Civilians began cleaning up, salvaging what could be saved, and trying to rebuild lives disrupted by the siege. American soldiers helped where possible. Combat engineers assisted with rubble clearance. Medics treated civilian injuries. Supply units shared rations with families whose food stocks had been exhausted. The relationship between American forces and Belgian civilians was complex gratitude for liberation, mixed with trauma from the battle's devastation, relief at survival shadowed by grief for those killed. The corridor remained the lifeline. All reinforcements, all supplies, all evacuations depended on that single road staying open. German artillery continued interdicting it. American forces continued defending it. Convoys continued moving through it, accepting losses as the price of sustaining operations. The corridor became the battle's symbolic focal point, proof that American determination could maintain supply lines even under the worst conditions. By December 28, Bastogne was secure but still contested. The siege had been broken, but the perimeter remained under pressure. German forces continued attacking, trying to reduce the American salient that Bastogne represented. American forces continued defending and planning counteroffensives that would expand Allied control and push German forces back toward their starting positions. The defense of Bastogne entered history as one of the war's iconic battles. A garrison surrounded and low on supplies had held against superior forces through determination, skill, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. The relief by Patton's Third Army demonstrated operational flexibility and aggressive leadership. Together, the siege and relief became a story American forces would tell for generations, proof that difficult situations could be overcome through courage and competence. But in late December 1944, none of that was certain. Soldiers defending Bastogne knew only that they had survived the siege, that relief had arrived, and that the battle continued. The corridor was open, supplies were flowing, and orders were clear. Hold the ground, prepare for offensive operations, and maintain pressure on German forces. The battle wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase. While Bastogne grabbed headlines and imagination, the northern shoulder of the German offensive was being decided on less famous ground. Elsenborn Ridge was high terrain north of the main German thrust forested hills, overlooking roads the 6th Panzer Army needed to reach Liège and the Meuse. American forces held the ridge in strength, and holding it meant containing the northern German drive before it gained momentum. The defense began with geography. Elsenborn Ridge offered elevation, observation, and defensive positions that were difficult to assault. Units defending the ridge could see German forces approaching from miles away and call artillery onto assembly areas before attacks developed. The ridge's slopes channeled German advances into predictable approaches that American defenders could cover with interlocking fires. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held the northern shoulder. These were experienced formations. The 2nd Division was veteran of multiple campaigns. The 99th was green but learning quickly under fire. Together, they established defensive lines that covered approaches to Elsenborn Ridge and the critical road junctions behind it. Engineers reinforced positions with minefields, wire obstacles, and prepared demolitions on bridges German forces would need to cross. German attacks began on December 17th, continuing through late December. The 6th Panzer Army SS divisions, led by Sepp Dietrich, through repeated assaults against American positions. Infantry supported by tanks attacked along forest trails and through valleys, trying to break through to the ridge. Each attack was met with devastating defensive fire artillery, mortars, machine guns, and rifles coordinated to create kill zones that German troops had to cross under fire. The fighting was attritional and grim. German forces suffered heavy casualties, attacking uphill against prepared positions. American defenders took losses from artillery and the constant pressure of renewed assaults. But the ridge held. Every German attack was repulsed. Every penetration was sealed by counterattacks before it could be exploited. The northern shoulder remained locked in place, preventing German forces from advancing toward Liège. Artillery dominated the battle. American gun batteries, positioned behind the ridge, fired thousands of shells, daily defensive concentrations against German attacks, interdiction missions against supply routes, counter-battery fires targeting German artillery positions. The artillery was coordinated by forward observers on the ridge, who could see approaching German forces and direct fires with precision. German artillery responded with equivalent intensity. Shells pounded American positions continuously, trying to suppress defensive fires and create gaps for infantry assaults. The ridge became a landscape of craters and destroyed trees terrain reshaped by explosives. Soldiers lived in foxholes that were constantly being collapsed by near-miss shells, forcing continuous repair and repositioning. The northern shoulder fight received less attention than Bastogne, but was equally important strategically. By containing the 6th Panzer Army's advance, American forces on Elsenborn Ridge prevented the German offensive from achieving its northern objectives. Units that should have been driving toward Liège were instead stalled in forests south of the ridge, consuming fuel and ammunition without gaining ground. The operational consequence was profound. Half of Germany's offensive power was tied down in static fighting while the clock ran out on the entire operation. Casualties on both sides were severe. American divisions defending the northern shoulder suffered thousands of casualties, killed, wounded, and evacuated for frostbite and exhaustion. Replacements arrived continuously, integrated into units, and thrust immediately into combat. German losses were even higher. Attacking prepared positions in winter was a meat grinder that consumed infantry regiments at unsustainable rates. The weather remained miserable throughout. Freezing temperatures, snow, and occasional ice storms created conditions that killed as efficiently as bullets. Soldiers suffered from exposure, frostbite cases that required evacuation, hypothermia that killed men in foxholes. Medical personnel treated weather casualties alongside combat wounds. Recognizing that winter itself was an enemy, German forces never broke through Elsenborn Ridge. Despite repeated assaults, despite committing SS divisions that were supposed to represent Germany's elite forces, despite artillery barrages and tactical innovations, the northern shoulder held. American defenders maintained their positions, absorbed German attacks, and prevented breakthrough. By early January, German forces were withdrawing from the northern sector, abandoning attempts to advance and focusing on holding defensive lines further south. The defense of the northern shoulder was a quiet victory. No dramatic siege, no famous one-word messages, no relief columns racing against time. Just soldiers in frozen foxholes holding ground against repeated attacks, artillery crews firing until guns wore out, and commanders maintaining defensive integrity despite casualties and pressure. The operational result was decisive. The German offensive failed in the north, and failure in the north meant failure overall. By late December, the northern shoulder was secure. German forces had been contained, offensive momentum had stalled, and American defensive lines were intact. The battle would continue elsewhere, at Bastogne, along the Meuse approaches, and in the gradually shrinking Bulge created by German penetration. But in the north, the line held, and holding was victory. The German offensive didn't just split Allied lines, it split Allied command. On December 20, with German forces driving west and communication between American armies disrupted by the penetration, Dwight D. Eisenhower made a controversial decision. He temporarily transferred command of all Allied forces north of the German Bulge to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The decision was operational, not political. Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters was located in Luxembourg, south of the German penetration. Communication with American forces, north of the Bulge elements of the U.S. First Army was difficult and sometimes impossible. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters was positioned to command northern forces more effectively. Eisenhower concluded that unified command north of the penetration was essential for coordinating defensive operations and eventual counterattacks. The command arrangement angered American generals. Bradley felt the change implied lack of confidence in his leadership. Patton considered it unnecessary British interference in American operations. Both men accepted Eisenhower's decision, but resented it privately. Montgomery, for his part, approached the new responsibility with characteristic confidence, arriving at headquarters, assessing the situation, and issuing orders designed to stabilize the northern front. The command friction complicated operations but didn't paralyze them. Units continued fighting under whichever headquarters had tactical control. Supply arrangements continued functioning. Reinforcements moved where needed, regardless of command boundaries. Professional soldiers adapted to changed command relationships because adaptation was necessary for survival. Montgomery's approach emphasized consolidation. He ordered defensive lines strengthened, reserves positioned for counterattacks, and supply arrangements secured. Some American commanders found his caution frustrating. They wanted aggressive counterattacks immediately. Montgomery preferred building strength before attacking, ensuring that counteroffensives would succeed rather than failing due to inadequate preparation. The command arrangement lasted through the battle's critical phase. Montgomery commanded northern forces during the siege of Bastogne, the containment of Kampfgruppe Peiper, and the defense of the northern shoulder. His decisions were competent but not brilliant, careful, methodical, effective. When the crisis passed and American forces transitioned to counteroffensive operations, Eisenhower returned command of U.S. forces to Bradley. The episode left lasting tensions. Montgomery's public statements after the battle suggested that British intervention had saved American forces from disaster, a characterization American commanders rejected furiously. The truth was more nuanced. Montgomery had commanded competently during a crisis. American forces had fought with determination and skill, by cars, and the battle had been won through combined effort rather than any single leader's genius. Eisenhower managed the tensions with diplomatic skill. He praised all commanders publicly, emphasized Allied unity privately, and refrained from taking sides in arguments about credit and responsibility. His focus remained operational. The German offensive had to be defeated, the Allied advance had to resume, and personality conflicts couldn't be allowed to interfere with military effectiveness. By early January, the command situation had stabilized. Bradley commanded American forces across the entire front. Montgomery commanded British and Canadian forces in the north. Coordination occurred through regular meetings and continuous communication. The temporary crisis arrangements were replaced by normal command relationships, and attention shifted from defensive operations to planning the counteroffensive that would eliminate the German Bulge. The command friction during the battle illustrated broader Allied challenges. National pride, personal ambition, and differing operational philosophies created tensions that required constant management. Eisenhower's genius was maintaining Allied unity despite these pressures, balancing American and British interests, managing strong personalities, and keeping focus on defeating Germany rather than winning internal arguments. For soldiers in foxholes, command arrangements mattered less than immediate survival. They fought under whoever commanded their sector, followed whatever orders arrived, and focused on the tactical realities of cold, combat, and casualties. Higher-level command tensions were abstract concerns compared to the concrete problems of staying alive and completing missions. The battle was being won by soldiers, not staff officers, but staff work mattered. Logistics, reinforcement priorities, and operational planning required coordination at the highest levels. Effective command arrangements enabled those staff functions to work smoothly. Eisenhower's decision to temporarily reorganize command during the crisis was controversial but defensible. It prioritized operational effectiveness over pride, and effectiveness was what mattered when the battle's outcome was uncertain. By mid-January, the command controversy was fading. What remained was the battle's result: German offensive defeated, Allied lines restored, and preparations beginning for the final push into Germany. The temporary command arrangements had served their purpose and been dissolved. American and British forces continued cooperating effectively, united by the larger goal of destroying Nazi Germany. The command friction was a footnote to the larger story. But footnotes matter in coalition warfare, where unity is fragile and must be constantly maintained through deliberate effort. Eisenhower's ability to maintain that unity, even when decisions angered subordinates, was one of his most important contributions to Allied victory. The Luftwaffe bet everything on one morning. Operation Bodenplatte, baseplate, was Germany's last attempt to cripple Allied air power through a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields. The plan called for nearly 1,000 German aircraft to strike 17 Allied air bases simultaneously at dawn on the 1st of January, 1945. The objective was simple: destroy Allied aircraft on the ground, crater runways, and eliminate the air superiority that had been devastating German ground forces since December 23. The operation required perfect coordination and near-suicidal commitment. German pilots assembled before dawn at bases across Western Germany. Briefings were minimal. Pilots received target assignments, approach routes, and strict orders. Attack at low altitude, strafe parked aircraft, destroy as many planes as possible, withdraw immediately. Radio silence was absolute until the attack began. Navigation would rely on visual landmarks and timed waypoints, no electronic aids that might alert Allied radar. At approximately 9, German aircraft appeared over Allied airfields. The attacks achieved complete surprise. Allied ground crews were preparing aircraft for the day's operations when German fighters and fighter bombers swept over at treetop height, guns blazing. Parked aircraft exploded under cannon and machine gun fire. Fuel trucks detonated. Ammunition dumps ignited. Personnel dove for cover as bullets chewed through parked formations and base buildings. The damage was significant at some bases. Brussels-Yver Airfield lost dozens of aircraft destroyed or damaged. Eindhoven, Metz, and Ofoven airfields suffered similar losses. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons aircraft that had been punishing German ground forces for weeks burned on taxiways and in revetments. Runways were cratered by bombs, temporarily preventing takeoffs and landings. But the cost was catastrophic for Germany. Allied anti-aircraft defenses engaged the low-flying German aircraft with devastating effect. Automatic weapons and light flak guns fired into formations passing overhead, shooting down attackers at close range. German pilots, committed to pressing attacks despite defensive fire, flew into walls of tracers and high-explosive shells. Aircraft disintegrated in mid-air. Others crashed, attempting to escape after being hit. German losses exceeded 300 aircraft, nearly one-third of the attacking force. More critically, the pilots lost were irreplaceable. By January 1945, Germany's pilot training program had collapsed under fuel shortages and Allied bombing. Experienced pilots killed over Allied airfields couldn't be replaced with equally skilled aviators. The Luftwaffe's operational capability, already declining, took a blow from which it never recovered. Allied losses were replaced within days. Aircraft destroyed on the ground were rebuilt or replaced from production that Germany couldn't match. Damaged runways were repaired by engineering battalions within hours. Within 72 hours, Allied air operations resumed at pre-attack intensity. The temporary setback was exactly that, temporary. For Germany, Bodenplatte was a strategic disaster disguised as a tactical success. Yes, Allied aircraft had been destroyed. Yes, some bases were temporarily out of action, but the operation consumed resources Germany desperately needed elsewhere, killed pilots who couldn't be replaced, and achieved nothing lasting. Within a week, Allied air power was again dominating the Ardennes battlefield, destroying German supply columns and supporting ground operations. The operation also revealed Germany's desperation. Committing nearly 1,000 aircraft to a single-day operation indicated how few options remained. A strong air force would have maintained sustained operations, gradually wearing down enemy capabilities. A weak air force gambled everything on one attack, hoping for decisive results. Germany was clearly in the latter category, unable to sustain operations, forced to bet everything on increasingly desperate moves. Allied intelligence drew the correct conclusions. Post-attack analysis confirmed that the Luftwaffe was declining rapidly. German aircraft production couldn't replace losses. Pilot training couldn't maintain quality or numbers. Fuel shortages limited operational tempo. The Bodenplatte attack was Germany's last gasp, one final attempt to regain air superiority before operational collapse. On the ground, German forces fighting in the Ardennes saw the consequences immediately. Allied fighter bombers returned to the skies within days, resuming attacks on German columns. Close air support for American ground forces resumed. German supply convoys returned to moving only at night, burning precious fuel to avoid daylight attacks. The brief respite from Allied air power ended, and German ground forces were again subject to constant aerial threat. The operation's failure accelerated the Ardennes offensive's collapse. German ground forces needed air support, or at least freedom from Allied air attack, to maneuver effectively. Bodenplatte was supposed to provide that freedom. Instead, it consumed resources and achieved nothing lasting. German commanders on the ground understood they would receive no meaningful air support for the remainder of the battle, and probably for the remainder of the war. By January 3, Operation Bodenplatte was over. Germany had lost hundreds of aircraft and pilots. Allied air power was temporarily disrupted but fundamentally intact. The strategic balance had shifted further against Germany. One more gamble had failed. One more resource had been wasted. One more sign that the Reich was approaching operational collapse. The Luftwaffe never recovered. For the remaining months of the war, German air forces operated sporadically, unable to contest Allied air superiority, reduced to desperate defensive missions, protecting German cities from strategic bombers. The pilots killed over Allied airfields on the 1st of January 1945 were among the last competent aviators Germany possessed. Losing them meant losing the Luftwaffe's future. The attack entered history as a footnote, one more failed German operation in a war Germany was losing. But for the pilots who flew that morning, and for those who died in burning aircraft over Belgium, it was the end of everything they'd fought to preserve. The Luftwaffe was finished, and with it Germany's ability to fight as a modern military power. The counter-offensive didn't advance through open country, it ground through villages. Every hamlet, every crossroads, every cluster of stone farmhouses became a battle. German forces, defending the Bulge, established positions in buildings, using thick walls as protection and upper floors as firing positions. American forces attacking had to clear each structure individually, room by room, sometimes floor by floor. The fighting was intimate and brutal. Infantry squads approached buildings under covering fire from supporting tanks and machine guns. Grenades were thrown through windows, followed by rifle fire. Soldiers kicked in doors, clearing rooms with automatic weapons at point-blank range. Defenders fought from cellars and upper floors, retreating through buildings as attackers advanced. Every structure had to be secured before the advance could continue. Casualties were high on both sides. American infantry took losses from defensive fire machine guns positioned to sweep approaches, riflemen firing from windows, grenades dropped from upper floors onto soldiers below. German defenders suffered from artillery and tank fire that demolished buildings, from grenades and close quarters combat, and from the simple exhaustion of defending without relief or resupply. Villages were destroyed in the process. Artillery and tank fire collapsed buildings. Fires spread through structures damaged by fighting. Civilians sheltering in cellars found their homes transformed into rubble. Some villages were reduced to ruins, nothing standing except partial walls and chimneys marking where buildings had been. Belgian civilians emerged from shelters to find streets unrecognizable, landmarks destroyed, entire neighborhoods erased. The winter weather made everything harder. Snow covered streets and fields, concealing obstacles and making movement treacherous. Ice made roads impassable for vehicles, except at walking speed. Freezing temperatures created mechanical failures, weapons that jammed, vehicles that wouldn't start, equipment that broke from cold stress. Soldiers fought in conditions that tested endurance as much as courage. Engineers followed combat troops, clearing rubble and repairing damage. Bulldozers pushed destroyed vehicles off roads. Sappers cleared mines from streets and buildings. Bridge crews rebuilt crossings demolished during fighting. The work continued under fire, German artillery interdicting villages recently captured, forcing engineers to work while shells crashed nearby. Medical personnel established aid stations in captured villages. Cellars became operating rooms. Church basements became wards, where wounded waited for evacuation. Medics worked continuously, treating American casualties and sometimes German wounded who couldn't be evacuated. Supplies were limited despite relief efforts. Bandages, plasma, and morphine remained scarce enough that medical personnel triaged ruthlessly. Civilians complicated every operation. Belgian families trapped by fighting needed shelter, food, and protection. American forces shared rations when possible, but couldn't fully support civilian populations while conducting offensive operations. Some civilians were evacuated to rear areas. Others remained, hiding in cellars and hoping the battle would pass quickly. German forces defended tenaciously, but were gradually forced back. Each village lost was ground that couldn't be retaken. Each defensive position overrun was one fewer strongpoint protecting German lines. The retreat wasn't rout. German units withdrew in order when positions became untenable, establishing new defensive lines further east and continuing to resist. But the direction was clear. German forces were being pushed back toward their starting positions. American tactics evolved during the village fighting. Combined arms coordination, improved tanks, supporting infantry, artillery firing on call, engineers clearing obstacles rapidly. Soldiers learned to clear buildings efficiently, standard procedures for room clearing, techniques for using grenades, and automatic weapons in confined spaces, methods for avoiding friendly fire incidents during confused close quarters fighting. The advance measured progress in villages captured. Maps tracked red and blue positions moving east as American forces pushed German defenders back. Each village secured meant another mile gained, another German position eliminated, another step toward eliminating the Bulge. Progress was slow, maybe a village per day in some sectors, sometimes less in heavily defended areas. But progress was constant. Morale among American forces improved as the offensive gained momentum. Soldiers who had spent December defending and retreating were now advancing and winning. The psychological shift was significant, from passive victims of German initiative to active agents driving German forces back. Victories bred confidence, which bred more effective combat performance. German morale declined correspondingly. Soldiers defending villages understood they were fighting a losing battle. Supplies were scarce, ammunition limited, reinforcements non-existent. The Ardennes offensive had failed, and now German forces were paying the price in blood for territory that would be lost regardless of defensive efforts. Some units fought with determination born of professionalism. Others showed reduced will to resist, surrendering when positions became untenable rather than fighting to the death. Prisoner counts increased as the American advance continued. German soldiers captured in village fighting were disarmed, searched, and sent to rear area collection points for processing. Intelligence officers interrogated prisoners, gathering information about unit dispositions, morale, and supply situations. The interrogations confirmed what battlefield evidence suggested. German forces were exhausted, undersupplied, and retreating. By mid-January, the pattern was clear. American forces were methodically reducing the German salient through continuous pressure across multiple sectors. German defensive lines were contracting. The Bulge was shrinking. What had been a dangerous German penetration threatening Allied logistics was becoming a pocket that would soon be eliminated entirely. But the cost was measured in destroyed villages and exhausted soldiers. Every village cleared meant buildings ruined and civilians displaced. Every mile gained meant casualties on both sides. The winter battle ground forward with mechanical inevitability. American forces attacking, German forces defending and retreating, both sides suffering from cold and combat. The frozen villages became monuments to winter warfare's brutality. Stone buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered by shellfire, civilians traumatized by violence that had destroyed homes and killed neighbors, soldiers fighting through ruins while snow turned red with blood. The Ardennes villages paid the price for military operations conducted through their streets and homes. By late January, most villages in the Bulge had been liberated and destroyed. The order to withdraw came without fanfare or drama. German commanders at all levels understood by mid-January that the Ardennes offensive had failed completely. Territory gained couldn't be held. Objectives remained unreached. Allied forces were counterattacking across the entire Bulge, and German defensive lines were collapsing under pressure. Withdrawal was the only option that preserved any portion of the forces committed to the operation. But withdrawal under pressure was among the most difficult military operations. Units had to disengage from contact with attacking forces, establish rear guards to cover the retreat, and move east over the same roads they'd used, advancing west roads now under Allied air attack and artillery interdiction. Supply arrangements had to function in reverse, moving supplies east while evacuating wounded and damaged equipment. The entire operation required coordination, discipline, and luck. German forces began withdrawing in phases starting mid-January. Forward units pulled back to intermediate defensive lines while rear guards fought delaying actions. Artillery remained in position, providing covering fire until the last moment, then limbered up and moved east. Tanks and assault guns, when they had fuel, covered the withdrawal, engaging American forces that attempted pursuit, then withdrawing to new positions. When fuel ran out, vehicles were destroyed in place to prevent capture. Allied forces pressed the retreating Germans relentlessly. American infantry advanced continuously, maintaining contact and preventing German forces from establishing stable defensive lines. Artillery fired constantly, interdicting withdrawal routes and striking German forces wherever they massed. Tank columns pursued, engaging German rear guards and attempting to cut off retreating units. The weather shifted to favor Allied operations. Clear skies returned intermittently, allowing Allied aircraft to attack German columns. Fighter bombers strafed vehicles on roads, destroying trucks and tanks attempting to escape. Medium bombers struck German assembly areas and supply points. The aerial onslaught made daylight movement suicidal. German forces were forced to move only at night. Slowing the withdrawal and creating traffic jams that persisted until dawn forced units into hiding. German casualties during the withdrawal exceeded those from the initial offensive. Soldiers marching east in winter conditions suffered from exhaustion and exposure. Wounded who couldn't be evacuated were left behind, sometimes in civilian homes with notes requesting care, sometimes simply abandoned. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Vehicles out of fuel were destroyed. Artillery pieces without tractors were spiked and left. Supply dumps were burned to prevent capture. The withdrawal routes became killing zones. Allied artillery and aircraft turned roads into wreckage-strewn corridors lined with destroyed vehicles. German columns attempting to move were caught in the open and massacred. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Trucks broke down from mechanical failure and cold, blocking roads for following vehicles. The retreat became a race to reach German lines before being cut off or destroyed. Some German units maintained discipline and cohesion during the withdrawal, experienced formations, conducted fighting retreats, moving in bounds, with rear guards covering each phase, supply and wounded being evacuated methodically. These units reached German defensive lines intact, bloodied but still organized. Their performance demonstrated professional competence under the worst circumstances. Other units disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned equipment and fled east individually or in small groups. Officers lost control of formations. Heavy equipment was left behind. Some soldiers surrendered rather than attempting to continue retreating. The breakdown of discipline was sporadic. Some units held together, while adjacent formations dissolved. Allied pursuit was aggressive but cautious. American commanders wanted to destroy German forces before they escaped, but they also wanted to avoid running into prepared defensive positions or ambushes. The advance continued, steadily maintaining pressure, capturing territory, but avoiding reckless charges into unknown situations. The operational goal was to eliminate the Bulge completely, not to take unnecessary casualties, pursuing a defeated enemy. German defensive lines east of the Bulge were being prepared during the withdrawal. Engineers constructed field fortifications, laid minefields, and registered artillery on likely American approach routes. These defensive positions were intended to prevent Allied pursuit from continuing directly into Germany. The calculus was brutal. Sacrifice forces in the Ardennes to buy time for establishing defenses that might slow the Allied advance toward the Rhine. By late January, German forces had largely withdrawn from the deepest penetrations. The Bulge was shrinking rapidly. Territory Germany had seized in December was being abandoned in January. The front line was moving east, approaching the positions where the offensive had begun. American forces occupied villages that had changed hands multiple times, cleared forests that had seen weeks of fighting, and established control over road networks that had been critical to both sides' operations. The withdrawal confirmed what Allied intelligence had already concluded. Germany was losing the war. The Ardennes offensive had been a desperate gamble that failed. Resources committed to the offensive men, armor, fuel, ammunition were losses Germany couldn't afford and couldn't replace. The withdrawal was recognition of operational reality. Germany lacked the strength to hold territory in Belgium and had to consolidate defensive positions to survive the Allied offensives that would inevitably follow. Belgian civilians watched German forces retreat with mixed emotions. Relief that the battle was ending mixed with trauma from what they'd endured. Joy at liberation tempered by grief for those killed and homes destroyed. Belgian communities began assessing damage, identifying casualties, and planning reconstruction, even as fighting continued in adjacent areas. American forces occupied liberated territory and prepared for the next phase. Engineers repaired roads and bridges. Supply dumps were established in captured villages, and units were reorganized after weeks of combat. The transition from defensive operations to counteroffensive to pursuit had been continuous soldiers fighting through Christmas and New Year, through bitter cold and constant combat, toward a victory that was becoming visible. But the victory wasn't complete. German forces still held portions of Belgian territory. The Bulge still existed, though shrinking daily. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't over just entering its final phase. The withdrawal continued, measured in miles per day and casualties that mounted despite retreat. The map told the story more clearly than any casualty report. By January 16, the Bulge that had penetrated nearly 60 miles into Allied lines was contracting rapidly. American forces attacking from north and south were closing the gap, squeezing German forces into a narrowing salient. Allied commanders planned a meeting of forces from opposite directions. First Army driving south, Third Army driving north, that would completely eliminate the Bulge and restore the front line to its pre-offensive positions. The symbolic location for the link-up was Houffalize, a small Belgian town that sat roughly at the center of the remaining German salient. American forces converged on Houffalize from two directions. The U.S. First Army's 2nd Armored Division advanced south through winter conditions, clearing German positions and maintaining continuous pressure. Patton's 3rd Army drove north, with the 11th Armored Division leading the advance toward the meeting point. The advance was contested every mile. German forces establishing defensive positions fought delaying actions designed to slow American progress. Each village was defended, each road junction contested, each kilometer purchased with German casualties that the Wehrmacht could no longer afford. But the delaying actions couldn't stop the advance, only slow it, buying hours at most before American firepower and numerical superiority forced another withdrawal. Allied artillery dominated the battlefield. Thousands of guns fired continuously, pounding German positions, interdicting withdrawal routes, and supporting American infantry attacks. The artillery was coordinated at corps and army level. Massive concentrations called onto German strongpoints, rolling barrages that preceded infantry advances, interdiction fires that made German movement deadly during daylight. Allied air power returned with devastating effect. Clear weather allowed continuous air operations. Fighter bombers attacked German vehicles, attempting to withdraw. Medium bombers struck German supply dumps and assembly areas. Reconnaissance aircraft tracked German movements, providing real-time intelligence that allowed ground forces to intercept retreating columns. The aerial dominance was total. German forces had no answer to Allied air attacks except hiding and moving only at night. On January 16, lead elements from 1st and 3rd Armies made contact near Houffalize. The meeting was anticlimactic. Patrols from opposing armies encountering each other on snowy roads, confirming identities and reporting contact to higher command. No ceremony, no celebration, just professional acknowledgement that the operational objective had been achieved. The Bulge was cut in two. German forces still in the salient were now in pockets that could be reduced systematically, but eliminating those pockets required continued combat. German units trapped west of the American link-up fought to break out east or establish defensive perimeters that might allow negotiated withdrawal. American forces surrounding these pockets attacked methodically, reducing each position through combined arms, assault artillery, armor, and infantry, coordinated to destroy resistance while minimizing American casualties. Some German units surrendered when escape became impossible. White flags appeared on defensive positions. German soldiers emerged from foxholes and buildings, hands raised, weapons abandoned. They were searched, disarmed, and marched to prisoner collection points. Intelligence officers interviewed prisoners, gathering information about unit identifications, morale, and remaining German strength. Other German units fought until destroyed. Isolated positions held by soldiers determined to resist were eliminated through overwhelming firepower. Artillery leveled buildings. Tank fire demolished defensive positions. Infantry assaulted only after resistance had been suppressed by supporting fires. The fighting was one-sided. German forces, surrounded and outgunned, had no chance of victory, only the choice between surrender and death. Civilian casualties continued throughout the reduction operations. Belgian civilians trapped in combat zones died from artillery fire, crossfire, and simple exposure. Families who had survived the offensive's initial phase died in its final days. Victims of battles fought through their communities. The humanitarian cost was staggering, measured in displaced families, destroyed homes, and lives ended without military purpose. By January 25, the Bulge had been eliminated completely. The front line had returned approximately to where it had been on December 16. Territory Germany had captured was back in Allied hands. Villages destroyed during the offensive were in Allied rear areas, beginning the slow process of reconstruction. The tactical situation was effectively reset, except for the casualties, the exhaustion, and the resources consumed. The operational outcome was decisive Allied victory. Germany had committed massive forces to an offensive designed to split Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The offensive had achieved surprise and initial success, but had failed completely in its strategic objectives. Not a single major operational goal had been met. The Meuse River was never reached. Antwerp remained securely in Allied hands. Allied armies were bloodied but intact, and now preparing to continue their advance toward Germany. For Germany, the cost was catastrophic. Casualties exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded, and captured, though exact figures remain disputed. Armor losses were irreplaceable. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. Artillery, vehicles, and equipment were lost in quantities that German industry couldn't replace. Fuel consumed in the offensive was fuel that wouldn't be available for defensive operations on the Eastern Front, where Soviet offensives were preparing to resume. For Allied forces, the cost was severe but bearable. Roughly 75,000 American casualties killed, wounded, and missing made the Battle of the Bulge the deadliest battle American forces fought in the European theater. British casualties were relatively light, as British forces were engaged primarily in containing the northern shoulder. But American losses, while painful, were replaced through the continuous flow of reinforcements from the United States. Industrial production replaced destroyed equipment. The Alliance recovered from the battle's cost and prepared to continue offensive operations. The battle's strategic consequence was final confirmation of Germany's impending defeat. Germany had gambled everything on the Ardennes offensive, committing reserves that should have defended against Soviet advances, consuming fuel that couldn't be replaced, losing armor and aircraft that represented the Wehrmacht's last mobile striking power. The gamble failed completely. Germany was now weaker than before the offensive, facing Allied armies that were stronger, better supplied, and positioned to advance directly into German territory. Belgian civilians emerged from cellars and shelters to assess the damage. Entire villages were destroyed, buildings collapsed, infrastructure wrecked, farmland cratered by artillery and littered with destroyed equipment. Families counted their dead, searched for missing relatives, and began the overwhelming task of rebuilding lives shattered by 6 weeks of combat. Allied military government and civilian relief organizations began providing assistance, food, medical care, temporary shelter, but the scale of destruction exceeded any aid program's capacity. American soldiers occupied positions they defended in mid-December. Some returned to the same foxholes they dug before the German offensive. The defensive positions were exactly where they'd been, but the soldiers were different, hardened by combat, reduced in number by casualties, and grimly aware of what winter warfare cost. Units that had entered the battle, green emerged veteran. Soldiers who had been confident of quick victory now understood that defeating Germany would require continued sacrifice. The Ardennes winter began to ease as January ended. Temperatures remained cold, but less brutal. Snow gradually melted, revealing landscapes transformed by combat forests, reduced to splintered stumps, fields cratered and scarred, roads lined with destroyed vehicles. Spring would eventually arrive, grass would grow, and nature would begin obscuring the battle's physical traces. But the human cost would remain in cemeteries, in veterans' memories, and in Belgian communities that lost civilians and infrastructure. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The Bulge had been flattened. Allied lines were restored. German forces were in retreat. The war would continue across the Rhine, into Germany proper, toward Berlin and final victory. But the Ardennes phase was finished, leaving only the counting of costs and the assessment of lessons. The numbers were disputed from the start and remain uncertain today. Casualty figures from the Battle of the Bulge vary depending on how casualty is defined, which units are included, and what time frame is considered. But certain figures are generally accepted by historians as reasonable estimates of the battle's human cost. American casualties totaled roughly 75,000 to 80,000 soldiers. This includes approximately 8,600 killed in action, 46,000 to 47,000 wounded, and 21,000 to 23,000 captured or missing. The figures represent the heaviest American losses in any single battle of the European theater. Some soldiers listed as missing were later confirmed dead. Others were prisoners who survived captivity and returned after the war. A few simply disappeared, bodies never recovered, fates never confirmed. British casualties were significantly lighter, roughly 1,400 total. British forces were engaged primarily on the northern shoulder, containing German advances but not involved in the heaviest fighting. The casualty disparity reflected operational reality. American forces bore the brunt of German attacks and the subsequent counteroffensive. German casualties are harder to quantify precisely. Estimates range from 67,000 to over 100,000, killed, wounded, and captured. The variation reflects incomplete records, disputes over which units should be counted, and Germany's deteriorating record-keeping as the war approached its end. A commonly cited figure is roughly 12,000 killed, 38,000 wounded, and 30,000 captured, but these numbers carry significant uncertainty. German armor losses were catastrophic and largely irreplaceable. Roughly 600 tanks and assault guns were destroyed, abandoned, or captured during the offensive and subsequent retreat. These losses represented a significant portion of Germany's remaining armored strength in the West. Replacement production couldn't match losses, and fuel shortages meant that even available armor often couldn't be deployed effectively. Aircraft losses compounded Germany's decline. Operation Bodenplatz cost over 300 aircraft destroyed and irreplaceable pilots killed, combined with losses from air combat over the Ardennes, to devastate the Luftwaffe's operational capability. Germany's air force never recovered, and for the war's remaining months, operated sporadically with declining effectiveness. Civilian casualties remain the most uncertain figure. Belgian civilians died from artillery fire, aerial bombing, crossfire, exposure, and the simple misfortune of living in combat zones. Estimates vary widely, from roughly 3,000 to over 5,000 civilian deaths. Many deaths weren't recorded bodies, buried quickly, families displaced, records destroyed. The true number will never be known with certainty. Material losses extended beyond battlefield casualties. Thousands of vehicles, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks were destroyed by both sides. Artillery pieces, numbered in the hundreds, were lost. Small arms, ammunition, equipment, and supplies consumed or destroyed represented resources that had to be replaced. For the United States, replacement was straightforward. Industrial production easily covered losses. For Germany, every loss was increasingly difficult to replace. The logistical cost was measured differently. Millions of artillery shells were fired during the battle. American artillery alone expended over 1 million rounds. Fuel consumption was enormous, particularly for German forces, whose entire offensive plan depended on captured supplies. Food, medical supplies, winter clothing, and all the materiel required to sustain armies in combat were consumed at rates that strained even American logistics. Infrastructure damage across the Ardennes was extensive. Roads were cratered, bridges destroyed, rail lines severed, villages were reduced to rubble. Farmland was littered with unexploded ordnance that would kill civilians for years after the war. Forests were devastated, trees shattered by artillery, areas burned by incendiaries, landscapes transformed into barren wastelands. The battle's economic cost extended beyond immediate military expenses. Belgian communities required massive reconstruction aid. Displaced families needed housing, food, and employment. Agricultural productivity declined in areas where fighting destroyed farms and killed livestock. The economic disruption rippled through Belgian society for years, creating long-term costs that far exceeded immediate battle damage. Psychological casualties were never fully counted. Soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, what would later be called PTSD, returned home carrying invisible wounds. Belgian civilians traumatized by 6 weeks of combat experienced psychological damage that affected families and communities for generations. The mental health cost of the battle was real but largely unmeasured, treated inadequately by 1945 medical understanding, and left to individuals and families to manage. The strategic cost to Germany was beyond calculation. The Ardennes offensive consumed Germany's last operational reserves in the west. Forces committed to the offensive could have defended against Soviet advances on the Eastern Front. Fuel burned in Belgium was fuel that wouldn't power defensive operations elsewhere. The offensive's failure meant Germany had no strategic options remaining, except hoping that defensive operations could delay defeat long enough for a political miracle that never came. For the United States, the cost was painful but sustainable. American industrial production replaced losses quickly. Reinforcements arrived continuously from training camps in the United States. The American economy's capacity to sustain military operations was essentially unlimited. Losses from the Ardennes were absorbed without diminishing overall combat capability. The human cost was real and tragic, but it didn't threaten American strategic objectives. The disparity in sustainable costs was the war's fundamental reality. Allied nations, particularly the United States, could absorb losses and continue fighting at full strength. Germany couldn't. Every German casualty, every destroyed tank, every consumed gallon of fuel was a permanent loss that weakened Germany's overall capability. The Ardennes offensive accelerated Germany's decline rather than reversing it. By late January, the accounting was incomplete, but the trend was clear. Germany had lost catastrophically. Allied forces had suffered severely, but remained operationally effective. The battle had killed tens of thousands, destroyed hundreds of villages, and consumed vast resources. But its strategic outcome was decisive. Germany's last Western offensive had failed completely, and the path to Allied victory was now clear. The cost would be remembered, debated, and analyzed for decades. But in January 1945, the immediate concern was moving forward across the German border, toward the Rhine, into the heart of Nazi Germany. The Battle of the Bulge was history. The war's final chapter was beginning. The Ardennes offensive failed for reasons that were clear even before it began. Hitler's plan assumed conditions that didn't exist and required capabilities Germany didn't possess. Every operational assumption was optimistic to the point of fantasy. When reality imposed itself through weather, logistics, and American resistance, the plan collapsed under the weight of its own impossible requirements. The weather assumption failed first. Germany's plan depended on bad weather keeping Allied aircraft grounded. That assumption held for the offensive's first week, allowing German columns to move without aerial attack. But weather is unpredictable, and on December 23 the skies cleared. Allied fighter bombers and medium bombers returned, destroying German vehicles, interdicting supply routes, and supporting American ground forces. The operational impact was immediate, and catastrophic German forces that had moved freely under cloud cover were now massacred during daylight movement. The fuel assumption was fantasy disguised as logistics. German planners calculated that advancing forces would capture American fuel dumps and use captured gasoline to continue the offensive. This wasn't contingency planning. It was the plan's operational foundation. When American forces destroyed fuel dumps during retreat or defended them successfully, the German advance stalled. Kampfgruppe Piper's fate illustrated the consequence. The most powerful German spearhead ran out of fuel short of objectives, forced to abandon vehicles and attempt escape on foot. The surprise assumption succeeded, but didn't matter strategically. Germany achieved complete tactical surprise on December 16. American forces were genuinely unprepared for a major offensive in the Ardennes. But surprise alone doesn't win battles. Exploitation does. German forces needed to convert surprise into rapid breakthrough and deep penetration. Instead, they became entangled, fighting for road junctions at Lanzerath, Street, Vith, and Bastogne. American defenders, surprised but not paralyzed, fought delaying actions that consumed German time and fuel. The road network assumption ignored reality. The Ardennes had inadequate roads for mechanized armies. Narrow lanes designed for farmers and timber trucks couldn't support the traffic density required by modern armored divisions. German columns created massive traffic jams when vehicles broke down, when roads were blocked by destroyed bridges, when multiple divisions tried to move through single-lane routes. The logistical choreography required for the offensive was impossible given the road network's limitations. The American response exceeded German expectations. German intelligence assumed American forces would retreat in disorder when attacked. Instead, American units fought effective delaying actions, held critical road junctions beyond reasonable expectations, and maintained organizational cohesion despite battlefield setbacks. The defense of Bastogne, the stand at Street Vith, and the containment of Kampfgruppe Paper all demonstrated American tactical competence that German planners had underestimated. The operational timeline was unrealistic from inception. German planners calculated that armored spearheads had to reach the Meuse River within 48 hours. That required average advance rates of 30-40 miles per day through winter conditions, over inadequate roads, while fighting a defending enemy. No mechanized force in World War II consistently achieved such advance rates under comparable conditions. The timeline wasn't ambitious. It was impossible. German reserves didn't exist in meaningful numbers. The offensive committed Germany's last operational reserves in the West. When those forces became engaged in static fighting rather than rapid exploitation, no reserves remained to reinforce success or cover failure. American forces, by contrast, had strategic depth divisions, could be moved from quiet sectors. Airborne divisions could be deployed from France, and Patton's Third Army could be redirected north. The imbalance in available reserves meant Germany had one attempt, while America had multiple options. The strategic objective was unachievable even if tactical goals had been met. Suppose German forces had reached the Meuse, crossed successfully, and driven toward Antwerp. The operational challenge of holding extended supply lines through hostile territory, while Allied forces attacked from multiple directions, was insurmountable. Germany lacked the forces, fuel, and supplies to sustain deep penetration against Allied counterattacks. The plan assumed Allied collapse that had no basis in operational reality. Hitler's interference prevented realistic planning. Senior German commanders von Rundstedt model recognized the plan's flaws and recommended scaling it down to a limited offensive with achievable objectives. Hitler overruled them, insisting on the maximum variant that required impossible logistics and unrealistic operational assumptions. The result was a plan that looked impressive on maps, but couldn't function in reality. The intelligence failure was comprehensive. German intelligence underestimated American defensive capabilities, overestimated the time available before Allied reinforcements arrived, and failed to account for Allied operational flexibility. The assumption that American forces would collapse under German pressure ignored everything the Wehrmacht had learned fighting Americans since Normandy. Combat performance disparity favored the Allies. By December 1944, American forces had accumulated combat experience from multiple campaigns. Combined arms coordination had improved. Artillery doctrine was effective. Tank-infantry cooperation worked smoothly. German forces, while including veteran units, also included hastily formed divisions with limited training and green troops. The qualitative edge Germany once possessed had eroded through years of attrition. The technological balance favored the Allies. American artillery was more numerous, better supplied, and effectively coordinated. Allied air power was dominant when weather permitted. American logistics could sustain high-intensity operations indefinitely. German forces were operating at the end of stretched supply lines with dwindling resources. The material imbalance meant Germany had to achieve quick victory because prolonged operations favored the better supplied force. The operational concept ignored defensive advantages. Defending is easier than attacking. Road junctions are easier to defend than to capture. Small forces in defensive positions can delay larger forces attempting to advance. German planners understood these principles, but assumed German tactical superiority would overcome them. When American defenders fought competently from prepared positions, German attacks stalled despite numerical superiority in specific sectors. The winter conditions affected Germany more than the Allies. Cold weather imposed operational challenges on both sides, but Germany's logistical weaknesses made those challenges catastrophic. Vehicles broke down and couldn't be repaired due to parts shortages. Fuel froze in tanks that couldn't be refilled. Soldiers suffered from inadequate winter clothing. American forces faced the same weather, but had superior logistics, better equipment reserves, and systematic approaches to cold weather operations. The failure was inevitable once initial assumptions collapsed. The offensive depended on weather staying bad, fuel being captured, American forces collapsing, and roads supporting rapid movement. When weather cleared, fuel wasn't captured, Americans fought effectively, and roads created bottlenecks. The plan fell apart. No amount of tactical brilliance or soldier courage could overcome the operational realities that made the offensive unworkable. By late January, the reasons for failure were clear to everyone. German commanders acknowledged privately what they'd argued before the offensive. The plan was impossible, the resources inadequate, and the strategic objective unachievable. Hitler blamed subordinates for failing to execute his vision. Allied commanders analyzed the battle and concluded that German strategic desperation had overcome operational judgment. The Ardennes offensive failed because it had to fail. The plan required miracles, and miracles don't occur on schedule.